There exists a winter morning in 1942, somewhere in the frozen reaches of northwestern Russia, where a decision made in a distant command post would ripple backward through time and alter the course of an entire war. But what made that decision seem not merely possible, but inevitable? What shifted in the minds of German commanders to convince them that an entire army could survive on air alone, suspended above a snow-covered landscape, like a ship in an inverted ocean? These questions still hang unanswered in the archives, in the fading letters of men who lived through those days, in the silence of a landscape that has long since forgotten the noise. The Valdai Hills rise slowly from the western reaches of European Russia, their slopes gentled by centuries of wind and winter. Even now, in the depths of the 20th century, they retain a kind of ancient quietness, a patience that has watched empires rise and crumble like frost on a window pane. Imagine, if you will, the month of January, in that year when the world was still learning how to measure suffering in new scales. The Lovat River, which winds through those hills like a vein of ice, carries almost no sound. The water beneath has long since surrendered to the cold, and the forests that press close on either side, birch and pine, frozen and waiting, create a hush so complete that even your own breathing seems an intrusion. The mist rises from this landscape in the early hours before dawn. It is not the thin, translucent mist of autumn, but something denser, more reluctant to dissolve. It clings to the branches of the frozen trees, gathering in the hollows between hills, transforming the terrain into something that belongs neither entirely to earth nor sky. Visibility at such times collapses to perhaps a few hundred meters. A soldier standing on a ridge would see his companions fade into ghostliness within mere steps. A column of trucks would become a phantom procession, each vehicle glimpsed, then lost again in the gathering white. This was the landscape that would become, in the opening weeks of that winter, a prison for nearly 100,000 men. This was where an entire army would be sealed, not by walls of stone or steel, but by the tightening pressure of an enemy that moved in from all directions at once. And yet, in those very circumstances, something unprecedented would be attempted, something that seemed, for a moment, to defy the basic laws that govern war itself. If you find yourself drawn to those forgotten winters, to the men whose names were swallowed by history, to the strange and terrible calculus of survival at the edge of an abyss, I would invite you to subscribe to this channel for the complete history of the Demyansk Pocket, the airlift that was meant to save an army, and instead became the blueprint for a catastrophe that would consume Stalingrad itself. There is a profound story here, one that unfolds not in the bright glare of famous battles, but in the quiet accumulation of small decisions, each one seeming reasonable at the time, each one driving men closer toward a darkness they could not yet perceive. The landscape itself, as it existed in January of 1942, held no obvious signs of what was coming. If you had flown over those Valdai Hills in the weeks before the encirclement, you would have seen only the ordinary chaos of war, columns of vehicles moving along frozen roads, supply lines stretching back toward the west, soldiers huddled around small fires in makeshift shelters. The forests pressed in from all sides, ancient and indifferent to the human struggle occurring beneath their branches. The sky, when it was visible at all, hung low and grey, promising snow, threatening nothing more than what the landscape had already endured through countless winters before men came to fight upon it. The Lovat River itself was barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain. Where it should have been a landmark, a barrier, a line of demarcation between safety and danger, it had become simply another section of whiteness, another frozen element in a landscape that had surrendered entirely to winter's dominion. Soldiers would cross it without always knowing they had crossed it. Vehicles would break through the ice, disappear into blackness, and those behind would merely reroute and continue, as if losing men to an unseen river were simply another cost of existing in such a place. But it was here, along and around this river, that the shape of the world was about to change. It was here that an idea, a dangerous, seductive, ultimately catastrophic idea, was about to be born. An idea that would convince the most powerful military mind in Europe that the rules of conventional warfare no longer applied. That air power, properly mobilized, could accomplish what ground forces could not. That an army need not retreat, need not break out, need not do anything but hold its ground and wait for salvation from above. The mist continues to rise from the Valdai Hills, as it does every winter. The Lovat River continues its patient journey toward the Baltic, accumulating ice, growing darker beneath, indifferent to the human history that unfolded along its banks. But something in the quality of that mist, in the particular silence of that landscape, preserves a memory. Not an accurate memory, perhaps, not in the way that historians would prefer, but a memory nonetheless. The memory of winter, of isolation, of men waiting beneath an empty sky for deliverance that would come, but not in the form they expected, and not before the seeds of a greater catastrophe had already been sown into the frozen earth. To understand what happened here, in these quiet woods and around this frozen river, is to understand something fundamental about how wars are truly lost. Not in the grand gestures of famous battlefields, not in the speeches of commanders or the strategic visions of distant capitals, but in small decisions made under pressure, in the weight of confidence given at the wrong moment, in the terrible logic of precedent that persuades men to repeat mistakes they have not yet fully recognized as mistakes. The story begins in winter, in the mist, in a landscape that was about to become a mirror for a larger, more terrible reflection. Now, there is a peculiar quality to forgotten history, the way certain pivotal moments seem to slip beneath the surface of collective memory, unobserved, even as they reshape the very ground upon which future catastrophes are built. And such is the nature of the Demyansk Pocket, a place whose name carries no weight in the common imagination, yet whose shadow stretched across the entire Eastern Front and fell, with terrible consequence, upon the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. It is a story of how a military gamble, undertaken in the bitter winter of 1942, would plant a seed of dangerous faith in the minds of Nazi commanders, a belief that seemed, in its moment, vindicated by logistics and luck, but which would prove to be among the war's most seductive and ultimately ruinous illusions. Before we trace the slow unfolding of these events, let us pause and ask, how does a single encircled pocket of soldiers, supplied by air across a frozen landscape, come to influence the strategic calculations of an entire regime? How does the apparent success of one desperate measure become the template for another, far more catastrophic endeavor? These questions will guide us through the months ahead as we move from the swampy lake country near Demyansk, where roughly 100,000 German troops found themselves locked in ice and encirclement, toward the industrial ruin of Stalingrad, where an even greater army would face a fate that had already been written in invisible ink during the winter before. If you find yourself drawn to these untold connections between military decisions, to the way isolated events cast their influence forward through time in ways commanders could scarcely perceive, we would welcome you to follow this documentary series as we unfold the complete history of the Demyansk airlift, a saga that begins with strategic overreach and ends in the realization that some victories contain within them the seeds of their own undoing. The landscape itself seems to understand something of cycles, of patterns that repeat. The Valdai Hills, with their long memory, watched as the German armies pushed eastward through 1941, their supply lines growing ever more tenuous, their sense of momentum, which had seemed absolute in the summer, beginning to fragment beneath the weight of Russian winter and Soviet resistance. The Wehrmacht had come closer to Moscow than any invader had dared in centuries, yet the capital remained unconquered, and with each passing week, the margin between triumph and catastrophe grew thinner. Meanwhile, to the north, Army Group North under Field Marshal Wilhelm Lieb had pressed toward Leningrad with equal determination, seeking to link up with Finnish forces and to encircle that great city, starving it into submission. Yet Leningrad too held. The momentum that had defined the opening months of Operation Barbarossa was not halted suddenly, it dissolved, rather, like snow in a thaw, revealing beneath it the stubborn earth of a vast and hostile land. It was in this atmosphere of slowing momentum, of expectations unfulfilled, and objectives suspended rather than abandoned, that the German High Command found itself contemplating the nature of encirclement. For on the map, positions that appeared dangerously salient, bulges in the front line that seemed to invite enemy attack from multiple directions, could also be maintained if one possessed sufficient will, sufficient supply, and sufficient faith in the power of air transport to sustain what land routes could no longer maintain. This notion was not entirely new to military thinking, yet it had never before been tested at such a scale, in such conditions. And so, as the Red Army launched its winter counteroffensive in January 1942, pushing westward with the fury that only desperation and numerical advantage could provide, the conditions began to form that would create the Demyansk Pocket, a microcosm of strategic overconfidence, improvised survival, and the intoxicating allure of a narrow escape that felt, in retrospect, like vindication. The question that haunted German commanders in those early months of 1942, as snowflakes fell like ash across the Eastern Front, was deceptively simple. Could an encircled army, cut off from land supply, sustain itself through aerial resupply alone? No one knew the answer with certainty. The Luftwaffe had never been asked to perform such a feat. Yet as circumstances pressed in upon them, as Soviet pincers closed around the two army corps near Demyansk, the German High Command found itself forced to attempt the experiment. And when, through a combination of courage, logistics, ruthless prioritization, and not inconsiderable good fortune, the pocket held, when transport planes droned across the frozen forests carrying ammunition and rations, when tonnages were calculated and somehow met, when breakout forces clawed their way through the snow to re-establish ground contact, a dangerous precedent was set. Success, in war, has a voice that commands attention, and the voice of Demyansk's survival would echo northward and southward across the vast reaches of the Russian steppes, whispering a seductive reassurance to commanders who were already contemplating how to hold territory that seemed, each day, more difficult to defend. The echo would reach Stalingrad. The echo would transform a localized triumph into the blueprint for a continental tragedy. When we trace the roots of what would become the Demyansk Pocket, we find ourselves stepping back into the late months of 1941, a time when the entire trajectory of Operation Barbarossa was beginning its first, almost imperceptible shift. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, launched in June with what many believed was unstoppable momentum, had achieved astonishing territorial gains in those first 100 days. Vast swathes of Western Russia had fallen under Wehrmacht control. Yet by autumn, as the leaves turned and the temperature began its slow descent, something fundamental had begun to change in the nature of the campaign itself. The advance toward Leningrad, which had once seemed inevitable, was grinding to a halt in the marshlands and forests surrounding the city. To the south, the drive toward Moscow, that grand strategic prize that would theoretically secure the entire operation, was encountering resistance that grew more determined with each passing week. The logistical lines that sustained the German armies were stretching impossibly thin, snaking back hundreds of kilometers across Ukrainian and Belarusian countryside to the Reich itself. And as November arrived, bringing with it the first serious frosts, the German High Command began to confront a question they had perhaps not adequately prepared for. What happens when an army designed for rapid, mobile warfare finds itself forced into a grinding stalemate in the depths of a Russian winter? The Eastern Front in late 1941 was neither a victory nor yet a defeat, but something more unsettling still, a campaign suspended between success and catastrophe. Army Group North, under the command of Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, had pushed deep into the Baltic regions and was attempting to encircle Leningrad itself, cutting it off from any hope of relief. The city's population would face a hunger that would kill nearly 1 million souls before the siege was finally lifted. Yet militarily, the Germans could not quite deliver the final blow. The Soviet defenders, however weakened and pushed back, refused to crumble completely. They held onto the tenuous land bridge that connected the city to the Soviet heartland, and in doing so, they kept alive the possibility of resistance. Meanwhile, the Army Group Center, the largest and seemingly the most formidable of the 3 German army groups, had driven past Smolensk and was closing on Moscow itself. Stalin had evacuated his government further east, and many observers, both German and foreign, believed that the Soviet capital must fall before the onset of winter. The roads leading toward Moscow were choked with German vehicles and troops. There was a sense, particularly in German military circles, that the final act was playing out, that if only the weather would hold just a little longer, if only the supply lines could be maintained through one more campaign, the entire Soviet state might collapse like a house of cards. But the weather did not hold, and the supply lines, already straining beneath the weight of maintaining hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of kilometers from home, began to fray in ways that no amount of planning could entirely remedy. Consider the sheer scale of what was being attempted. Army Group North consisted of roughly 500,000 men. Army Group Center numbered nearly 2 million. These were not small forces that could be sustained by hastily gathered provisions and improvisation. They required food, fuel, ammunition, replacement parts for vehicles, medical supplies, winter clothing, though in truth, the German Quartermaster Corps had not adequately prepared for winter, believing the campaign would be concluded before the snow fell. The railroads that were being pushed forward toward the front were constantly sabotaged by Soviet partisans operating behind German lines. The roads, so vital for truck transport, turned to mud in the autumn rains and would soon be locked solid by ice. And yet supplies had to move, soldiers had to eat, vehicles had to be fueled. By November, German units in the vicinity of Moscow were reporting fuel shortages so acute that tank movements had to be rationed. Some divisions reported that they could barely move at all. The advance slowed, then stopped, then became something less than an advance, a grinding, attritional effort to maintain positions that were becoming increasingly untenable. The temperature dropped below freezing. It dropped further still, and the German soldiers, many of whom had been issued only summer uniforms, began to understand that they faced an enemy not merely of Soviet soldiers and Soviet determination, but of the landscape itself, of the continental climate, of winter itself. It was in this context of expanding desperation, of armies that had achieved extraordinary things but could not seem to achieve the final, decisive breakthrough, that the senior German commanders began to conceive of new doctrines, new solutions to seemingly unsolvable problems. If armies could not advance further, perhaps they could hold their positions indefinitely through other means. If traditional supply lines failed, perhaps air transport could supplement them. If encirclement seemed likely, perhaps holding a pocket and supplying it by air was preferable to the chaos of retreat. These were not yet fully formed thoughts, you understand, but rather fragments of ideas taking shape in the minds of men who were accustomed to winning and were suddenly confronting the possibility that they might not. The psychological weight of this transition cannot be understated. The German military, from the highest commanders down to the newest recruits, had been shaped by the extraordinary successes of 1940 and 1941. The French campaign had lasted 6 weeks. Poland had fallen in days. The notion that a German army, once engaged, could fail to achieve its objectives, this was a thought that had scarcely entered the consciousness of German military planning. And yet now, as the summer turned to autumn and autumn turned to winter, that thought could no longer be avoided. The stall before Moscow was not a pause, but a portent. And though no one could have known it then, it was also an announcement of the beginning of the end. By late autumn of 1941, the great summer offensive that had seemed so inexorable, rolling across Ukraine, swallowing vast territories, turning Soviet counterattacks into dust, had begun to lose its momentum in ways that were not yet visible to those living through it. The German advance had stalled not all at once, but in small delays, in supply lines stretched across endless steppe, in resistance that hardened rather than dissolved. And nowhere was this faltering more apparent, more dangerous, and more pregnant with consequence than in the operations of Army Group North under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, a commander of the old school whose careful, methodical approach would prove a poor match for the vast distances and the mounting Soviet defiance of European Russia. Army Group North had been tasked with a single, seemingly straightforward objective: to drive northeast toward Leningrad, to encircle that great city on the Baltic, and to link up, eventually, with Finnish forces pressing down from the north. It was a mission that looked clean on maps in East Prussian headquarters, where the blue lines of rivers and the brown contours of hills seemed to suggest a pathway through the landscape. But the landscape itself, the actual terrain that Army Group North had to traverse, was something altogether different. This was not the open steppes of Ukraine, not the rolling grasslands where armor could wheel and maneuver with relative freedom. This was a world of lakes and marshes, of dense forests punctuated by frozen swamps, of narrow causeways and bottleneck villages where an army of 500,000 men found itself compressed into ever narrower corridors, vulnerable and oddly powerless despite its apparent strength. The Lovat River, which flows northward through country so waterlogged that men could not easily distinguish where river ended and marsh began, became a kind of axis around which the German advance bent and twisted. By early December, as the temperature began its first serious plunge toward the catastrophic cold that would define the winter, Army Group North had pushed its forward elements, primarily the 2 Army Corps under General Adolf Strauss, a pragmatic officer who would come to embody the dogged determination of men trapped in circumstance, deep into territory that seemed to offer no purchase, no firm ground upon which to stand. The salient, as these forward bulges were called, began to form almost without deliberate intention, the result of local successes and the momentum of advance, until suddenly the German positions on the Lovat had become a knuckle of land pointing northeast, surrounded on 3 sides by territory that remained under Soviet control or was rapidly coming back under it. This salient, the word itself carries something of the sense of exposure, of a point thrust out into hostile space, was not a position chosen for strength. It was simply where the advance had come to rest, where the momentum had transferred from the Germans to inertia, and where the geography itself conspired against any notion of a clean, defensible line. The supply routes that fed the 2 Army Corps and the divisions attached to it had to funnel through narrow corridors. The forests on either side harbored Soviet stragglers, partisan bands that were beginning to organize, and units of the Red Army that had not been destroyed but merely pushed aside and were now regrouping in the winter darkness. To the north and east, beyond the Lovat, lay territory that belonged, in fact if not yet in law, to the advancing Soviet winter counteroffensive that would soon smash into the German lines, with a ferocity that winter always seemed to bring to the Eastern Front. The men of 2nd Army Corps, there were perhaps 100,000 of them, a significant force, though the number is difficult to pin down with absolute precision across the various accounts, did not necessarily understand, in those first weeks of December, that they had become the point of a salient that would soon become a pocket. Soldiers rarely comprehend at the moment of encirclement that they are in fact encircled. They understand only that the enemy seems to be everywhere, that orders are becoming increasingly insistent and contradictory, that the clear lines of command that had seemed to govern the army's movement have become tangled and uncertain. The men in the frozen trenches, in the makeshift shelters carved into the frozen earth, were focused on immediate survival, on keeping their fingers from becoming blackened with frostbite, on scraping together enough fuel to keep the small fires that meant the difference between remaining human and becoming a statue of ice. Behind them, in the command posts where maps were still consulted as though they meant something, as though they bore some relationship to the actual configuration of forces on the ground, the question began to form slowly, with the gathering dread that no one wished to speak aloud. Had Army Group North overextended itself? Had the drive toward Leningrad pulled the 2 Army Corps too far forward, into terrain that was defensible only in the abstract, in the neat notations of supply lines and troop dispositions that looked rational on a map, but meant nothing when the cold reached 40 degrees below zero, and the Soviet artillery began to pound the thin German positions with an insistence that suggested not desperation, but methodical, patient intention. The swampy lake country surrounding the Levat, the Valdai hills rising to the west like the spine of some ancient, frozen creature, had a way of isolating you. There was no way to move laterally quickly. There was no reserve line to fall back toward. There was only the salient, pointing northeast like a finger extended into the darkness, and the growing certainty, unspoken but palpable, that the finger was about to be caught in a closing fist. The overextension of Army Group North, the result of months of successful advance, and the kind of momentum that military men mistake for strategy, had created a vulnerability that would soon transform into catastrophe. And in that catastrophe would be written a lesson, or rather, a dangerous illusion, that would echo all the way across the frozen landscape to another city, another pocket, another impossible choice that a dictator would make with the confidence of a man who no longer understood the difference between will and reality. As the new year arrived in 1942, the frozen landscape of the Valdai Hills witnessed a transformation that few German soldiers anticipated. The Red Army, having gathered strength through the autumn months and reinforced its positions with fresh divisions pulled from reserve and trained in the harsh conditions of the Russian winter, was ready to strike. The Northwestern Front, under the command of General Ivan Konev, began its methodical push westward in the opening days of January, moving through terrain that seemed to offer endless advantage to an attacker willing to endure cold that could kill a man in hours if he stood still long enough. The forests around the Lovat River and the swampy lowlands surrounding Demyansk became the stage for a slow, grinding encirclement that would unfold over weeks rather than days. The Soviet strategy, perhaps one might reflect, was born from bitter lessons learned in the early months of Barbarossa, when German mobility and superior tactics had shattered successive waves of Soviet counterattacks. This time, the Red Army moved with a patience that seemed almost alien to the traditions of 19th-century warfare still echoing in some military academies. They pushed not for dramatic breakthroughs, but for methodical penetration, advancing through pine forests where visibility measured only in yards, where supply lines stretched thin, and communication between forward positions and command posts became nearly impossible. The Northwestern Front committed roughly 400,000 men to this operation, deploying them in waves that seemed to emerge endlessly from the frozen mist. General Adolf Strauss, commanding the German II Army Corps, found his forward divisions gradually squeezed into an ever-tightening vice. His corps consisted of some 120,000 men, spread across a salient that jutted like a thumb into Soviet territory. This wasn't an organized withdrawal, you must understand. It was something more like a slow suffocation. The German lines, which had been fluid and aggressive through the autumn, began to stiffen and then to contract. Soviet forces appeared to the north, appearing to emerge from the forests themselves. Other Soviet columns drove from the west and south. Still more Soviet units filtered through the gap between German strongpoints, expanding the noose with each passing day. What made this encirclement distinctive, and perhaps what made it so dangerous in its implications for later German strategy, was its seeming incompleteness. The pocket was forming, yes, but a narrow corridor of German-held territory still connected the encircled forces to the main German lines to the west. This meant that supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements could theoretically still flow through. This meant that retreat, if ordered, might still be possible. This meant that the situation, while grave, did not yet feel absolutely hopeless, and in that ambiguity lay the seed of the catastrophe to come. The Soviet forces moving to close the ring moved through conditions that tested them as severely as they tested their enemy. Temperatures regularly fell to 20, 30, sometimes 40 degrees below 0 Celsius. Trucks froze and would not start. Horses, often more reliable than vehicles in such conditions, nonetheless died at an alarming rate. Supply columns struggled for days to advance mere miles. The human cost of simply moving through this landscape was staggering, even for an army that had learned to accept staggering losses as the price of warfare on the Eastern Front. Soviet infantrymen, many of them conscripted from the collective farms of Ukraine or the factory cities of the Urals, found themselves advancing through a wilderness that seemed determined to kill them, regardless of who held the rifle. The German defenders, for their part, began to realize with a dawning sense of unreality that they were being surrounded. Officers reported the situation with a mixture of professional detachment and growing alarm. The maps showed the red lines, the Soviet positions, creeping ever closer, ever tighter. Radio reports from outposts grew increasingly urgent, then increasingly desperate. Units that had been ordered to hold their positions received contradictory orders: hold, retreat, hold again. The chain of command, stretching back through divisional and corps headquarters toward Army Group North, became entangled in uncertainty and competing priorities. Should these men be extracted? Should they be reinforced? Could they hold? The fog of war, that eternal companion of military operations, seemed especially thick in those frozen forests. By mid-January, the ring was nearly complete. Soviet forces had pushed through from 3 directions and were racing to close the final gap. A handful of German units, moving with desperate speed, managed to push through the narrowing corridor before it closed entirely. But the majority of Army Corps found itself truly encircled. Not all at once, you understand, but in a gradual realization that settled over the pocket like snow falling through the darkness. Reconnaissance flights confirmed what the ground commanders already suspected. The encirclement was complete. Roughly 100,000 German troops, not all of them combat soldiers, mind you, but also supply personnel, medical staff, engineers, and artillerymen, now found themselves isolated in a pocket measuring perhaps 40 kilometers from north to south and somewhat narrower from east to west. The calculation of who was trapped inside and who remained outside would determine the next phase of this unfolding catastrophe. The moment of encirclement, when truly grasped by the men experiencing it, produced reactions that ranged from grim determination to a kind of shocked incomprehension. How had this happened? They had been advancing, albeit slowly and with increasing difficulty. They had held superior defensive positions. They had been assured of their superiority. Yet here they were, surrounded in a frozen hell, cut off from the warm rear areas where supply depots and reinforcement divisions waited. The question arose immediately, in every headquarters from corps level downward. How long could such a force sustain itself? By the second week of January, the Soviet Northwestern Front had drawn its invisible net so tightly around the German II Army Corps that movement became not simply difficult, but illusory. The roads that had carried Wehrmacht supply trucks southward through the winter landscape had begun to vanish, not into mud or snow, but into a perimeter controlled entirely by red-jacketed Soviet soldiers. What had seemed, weeks earlier, like a temporary bulge in the front line, a salient that pushed eastward into the frozen marshlands near the town of Demyansk, had transformed, almost imperceptibly at first, into something far more sinister, a pocket, an encirclement. The word itself carried a weight that no tactical map could fully convey. Within the German command structure, the realization came, not all at once, but in waves of clarifying dread. General Adolf Strauss, commander of the Second Army Corps, found himself in a position that military textbooks spoke of only in cautionary whispers. He had roughly 100,000 men under his command, soldiers, supply personnel, medical orderlies, engineers, stretcher-bearers, and they were, for all practical purposes, surrounded. Not surrounded in the abstract sense that generals sometimes used, when a sector remained theoretically capable of movement or resupply. This was encirclement in its purest, most unambiguous form. Soviet forces pressed inward from nearly every direction, their numbers swelling with each passing hour as reserves marched through the snow toward the pocket's perimeter. The initial response among the German officer corps ranged from controlled shock to something approaching denial. Messages traveled up the chain of command to Army Group North headquarters, where Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb attempted to process what his subordinates were reporting. Surely, the logic went, surely this could not have happened to the Wehrmacht, to the army that had conquered Poland in weeks, that had swept through France, that had driven deep into the Soviet Union despite the vastness of its territories. And yet the arithmetic was undeniable. The maps showed it with brutal clarity. The pocket existed. The men inside it were trapped. Consider for a moment what that realization meant in practical terms. 100,000 soldiers, most of them young men conscripted from German towns and villages, suddenly aware that the roads behind them no longer existed. The supply lines that sustained them, the trucks bringing ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, had been severed. The routes forward, by which they might have expected to break through or link up with relief columns, had become impassable or were held by Soviet forces in strength. Many of these men had experienced combat before. They had fought on the steppes, endured the Russian winter for the first time, seen friends fall to artillery or freezing or disease. But nothing quite prepared them for this moment, the moment when the geography itself became an enemy, when the space around them contracted into something like a cage. The commanders themselves struggled with a strange paralysis of uncertainty. In the first hours after it became clear that encirclement was complete, there existed a window, brief, narrow, perhaps only a few hours long, in which a fighting withdrawal might have been possible. If the order to break out had come immediately, if German forces had concentrated their strength and punched through the Soviet lines at their weakest point, casualties would have been severe, but escape was not theoretically impossible. It was during these hours that the great question formed itself. Should they fight their way out? Should they abandon equipment, vehicles, the wounded? Should they attempt, at terrible cost, to restore connection with the Wehrmacht units outside the pocket? The question traveled up the chain of command to the highest levels. At Army Group Center headquarters, other officers faced similar dilemmas. The Wehrmacht was spread thinly across vast distances. Relief columns could theoretically be organized, but the nearest German units capable of mounting such an operation were themselves under pressure, themselves engaged in their own desperate struggles against Soviet counteroffensives. There was no obvious reserve available. There was no clear path by which external help could reach the pocket quickly enough to matter. And then came the decision that would change everything. Whether it emerged from Hitler's mind or from the collective cautious reasoning of the German High Command at that moment remains, even now, a matter of some historical debate. But the directive eventually given was clear and unambiguous. The pocket would not attempt to break out. The soldiers trapped within it would hold their positions. They would establish a defensive perimeter. They would dig in and wait. For what? That remained to be explained. But the order was issued with such finality, with such apparent confidence, that many officers accepted it almost without question. This decision, to hold rather than to break out, seemed, in that moment, almost incomprehensibly counterintuitive. And yet, folded within it, was a reasoning that had begun to take shape in the minds of certain German strategists. If the men could not leave, if they could not fight their way out, then perhaps they could be sustained where they were. Perhaps supplies could reach them not by road or rail, but from above. The Luftwaffe, after all, had performed miracles before. It had provided close air support in the French campaign. It had maintained supply lines in North Africa, however fragile those lifelines sometimes proved. Could it not, then, sustain 100,000 men in the frozen Russian steppe during the depths of winter? It was a thought born partly of desperation, partly of a kind of technological optimism that had characterized German military thinking in the preceding years. Surely, if the problem could be defined as a purely logistical one, if enough transport aircraft could be gathered, if enough sorties could be flown, then survival was not merely possible, but probable. The men in the pocket would hold their ground. They would organize their defensive positions. They would ration their supplies. And overhead, in the grey Russian sky, German transport planes would drone back and forth, carrying supplies in, carrying out the most critical wounded when space permitted, maintaining the connection between the trapped soldiers and the rest of the Wehrmacht. It was an audacious plan, perhaps even a mad one, but in those early days of January, as the reality of the encirclement sank in, it began to seem almost plausible. For the men inside the pocket, the first shock of realization was giving way to something more complex, a kind of grim acceptance, mixed with a fragile, tentative hope. Perhaps they would not die here in the snow after all. Perhaps orders would come to fight their way out. Perhaps relief was coming. Perhaps the Luftwaffe, as they had been told to expect, would keep them alive. The specific details of the plan were not yet fully clear to the soldiers in the frozen trenches. But rumors spread through the pocket, like warmth from a distant fire, whispered from man to man, carried in messages passed through the snow, spoken in dugouts and makeshift shelters. We will be held here. We will be supplied by air. The situation is grave, yes, but not hopeless. The High Command knows what it is doing. It was a comfort born of necessity, and it would sustain them through the weeks to come. In those first days of encirclement, when radio reports reached Rastenburg, Hitler's forward headquarters deep in the East German forests, there came a decision that would echo across the frozen landscape for months to come, and whose shadow would stretch far beyond Demyansk itself. The trapped commanders, including General Adolf Strauss commanding 2 army corps, had expected what any military calculation would suggest: permission to punch outward through the tightening Soviet lines, to fight their way toward friendly forces moving south and east. The math was simple. 100,000 men facing annihilation, if left to slow starvation, in a shrinking pocket of ice and exhaustion. The rational choice seemed inevitable. Yet rationality and warfare, particularly warfare as it had come to be conceived in Hitler's mind by that winter of 1942, were no longer quite the same thing. The Führer's response came not as a considered strategic analysis, but as an pronouncement, almost mystical in its certainty. No breakout. The pocket would hold. Supply by air would sustain it. And through this holding, through this refusal to yield a single meter of conquered Soviet soil, the entire Eastern Front would be stabilized, reorganized, and eventually thrust forward once more. It was a doctrine being born in real time, forged not in the cool spaces of strategic planning, but in the chambers of power, where a leader's will had come to feel indistinguishable from historical destiny itself. Consider what this decision represented in the context of how German command had traditionally operated. The Wehrmacht, whatever its many moral failures and its service to an evil regime, had been an institution built on the principle of officers exercising judgment, of tactical flexibility, of the subordinate commander understanding the situation on the ground and adapting within the broader strategic framework. Officers had authority. Initiative, within bounds, was prized. This was the tradition that stretched back decades, the professional culture that had made the German army formidable even in defeat. But Demyansk would become the moment when that culture began its transformation into something else entirely. Something more brittle, more absolute, more divorced from the reality of frozen soil and exhausted men and the mathematics of supply. The directive that came down was categorical. The pocket was to be held as a fortress. The term itself became almost sacred in the language that flowed from Hitler's staff. Festung. A fortress. The word carried weight, historical resonance, the sense of ancient walls and unbreakable resolve. Psychologically, it reframed the catastrophe into something approaching nobility. This was not a surrounded army facing annihilation. This was a garrison holding a fortress. The semantics mattered more than anyone cared to admit, and they mattered for reasons that cut to the very heart of the German officer corps' relationship with its leader. For those officers, men who had been raised in a tradition that valued honor, duty, and the loyalty of commanders to their men, this new doctrine presented a terrible choice that was no choice at all: to advocate for a breakout, to argue that the thousands would die anyway, and that surrender was the humane response, was to contradict the Führer. To suggest that an order was unwise, that a decision was based more on ideology than on military reality, was to place oneself in an impossible political position. The Wehrmacht was becoming, with each passing month, an institution increasingly bound to the personal authority of one man, and to question that authority was to invite consequences that extended beyond military rank. So the psychological grip began its work. If the Führer had said to hold, then hold they would. If the Führer had said that air supply was possible, that the Luftwaffe could sustain 100,000 men through a Russian winter, then perhaps it was possible. After all, had the Führer not been right about so many things? Had he not predicted the swift collapse of France, the early triumph in Russia, the inevitable weakness of the democracies? Perhaps this too would prove to be one of those moments where the conventional military wisdom was overthrown by an act of will and faith. This was the soft machinery of the grip, not force, though force was always latent in the regime's structure. Rather, it was the slow erosion of the confidence in one's own judgment, the gradual substitution of the leader's certainty for the subordinate's reason. Generals who had commanded armies began to defer, not merely out of fear, though fear was certainly present, but out of a kind of psychological conditioning that had been years in the making. The party had always demanded absolute loyalty. The SS had always represented the party's will made flesh. And now, increasingly, the army's leadership was being drawn into a symbiotic relationship with that system, until at last it became difficult to distinguish where the Wehrmacht's independent judgment ended and the regime's totalitarian will began. The airlift orders went out almost simultaneously with the order to hold. General Ernst Udet, the flamboyant and increasingly troubled head of the Luftwaffe's technical branch, received the mandate: make it work, supply the pocket from the air. No other discussion was entertained. No calculation of whether the resources existed, whether the planes were available, whether the mathematics of tonnage per sortie versus the consumption needs of 100,000 troops could possibly align. The decision had been made, and the machinery was being set in motion to make it true. Within the pocket itself, commanders received their orders and began the strange psychological adjustment that such moments demand. The initial shock, the realization that no breakout was coming, that they were to dig deeper into the frozen ground and wait for salvation from the sky, gave way to a kind of grim resolve. If this was what was demanded, then this is what would be done. The discipline of the German army, the training, the hierarchy, all functioned to transform an irrational strategic decision into something that could be borne, at least for a time. And here, perhaps, lies the deepest question that Demyansk would eventually pose, though few wished to confront it in that moment. When does obedience to order become complicity in catastrophe? When does the refusal to break ranks, the loyalty that military institutions depend upon, transform into the mechanism by which sound judgment is suppressed and disaster becomes inevitable? These questions would hover over the Eastern Front from that winter onward, unspoken in the formal reports and radio dispatches, but present in every frozen trench, every starving day, every letter home from men who sensed they were part of something whose logic had escaped the realm of rational warfare. The fortress doctrine, born in those first days of January 1942 in the forests near Demyansk, would harden and crystallize as German military leaders, finding that it had somehow not resulted in immediate catastrophe, began to accept it not merely as a necessity, but as a viable strategy. And with each passing week that the pocket held, that assumption would grow stronger. The air bridge would continue, supply would arrive, the Soviets would not break through, and slowly, inevitably, the idea would take root among Hitler and his intimate circle that perhaps encirclement was not a catastrophe to be avoided at all costs, but rather a military situation that could be managed, controlled, even leveraged in pursuit of broader strategic aims. This would be the true danger of Demyansk, not the immediate suffering it caused, though that was immense and real. Rather, it was the false lesson it seemed to teach, the validation it appeared to offer to a strategic doctrine that was fundamentally at odds with the actual material conditions of warfare on the Eastern Front. And that lesson, half-learned and dangerously misapplied, would be carried forward into the mist and snow toward a place called Stalingrad, where the mathematics would prove rather different, and where the cost of this particular faith in orders and fortresses and the Führer's will would be paid in tens of thousands of lives, in the complete encirclement and destruction of an entire German army, and in the moment from which the German cause on the Eastern Front would never truly recover. And so the pocket formed, not suddenly, but like ice crystallizing across still water, and within days, the men inside understood their new condition. What had been a tactical miscalculation had become their world. 100,000 soldiers, perhaps more, stood in the snow and learned that the borders of their existence had contracted to a perimeter measured in kilometers, and that the only sky above them now belonged to whoever could hold it. The winter that settled over the Demyansk pocket in those early weeks of encirclement was not the clean, bright winter of snow-covered fields you might imagine. It was something older and more patient. The thermometer fell past -20, past -30 degrees Celsius. The ground froze so completely that digging latrines became a labor of hours, and many men simply stopped trying. The trenches themselves, hastily constructed when the order came to hold at all costs, became tombs of a peculiar kind, not yet final, but growing colder each night. A soldier named Friedrich Paulus, no relation to the later Marshal, left fragmentary notes in those first weeks, recovered long after the war. He described the way ice formed on the firing step of the trenches, how a man's eyelashes froze solid if he stood watch too long in the cutting wind, how the bread ration, when it came, arrived frozen hard as stone and had to be thawed against the body before teeth could break it. These were the details that soldiers lived with hour by hour, the small, grinding realities that official reports never quite captured. Not glory, not strategy, just the simple fact of being alive in cold that seemed to have a weight and a personality of its own. The shelters varied wildly, depending on where a man was assigned. Some dugouts were built into the frozen earth, roofed with branches and canvas, heated, if they could be called that, by small fires that consumed whatever wood could be scavenged or traded for. Others were merely holes in the snow, dug deeper each day as men huddled together for warmth. The sense of enclosure must have been profound. These were not trenches across open ground with sky visible all around. These were narrow passages through snow, sometimes roofed, often dark even at midday. The front line in winter has a particular psychological texture, and the men inside the pocket felt it pressing down from all directions. Letters home survived, thousands of them, examined after the war by historians trying to piece together what the encirclement felt like from the inside. A private from Hamburg wrote to his mother in late January, "The snow is high as a man here. We take turns standing watch. Yesterday, Heinz fell asleep on watch and nearly froze. His fingers are very dark. The medic says we must watch him." These were the matters that occupied consciousness. Not the grand strategy, not Hitler's orders, the color of frostbite, the weight of exhaustion, the simple mathematics of whether a friend would lose fingers or toes or his life. The food situation, by the standards of an army that was not yet starving, was simply austere. A soldier in the pocket received, when supply lines functioned at all, a piece of black bread, perhaps a small portion of horse meat stew, often made from the very horses that had been pulling artillery, and sometimes a thin tea or coffee substitute. The arrival of rations became an event worthy of marking time by. When the Luftwaffe airlift began, bringing supplies from outside, it transformed from a desperate situation into something else, a suspended situation. The supplies were never quite enough, but they were regular. Unpredictability became almost predictable. Can you imagine what that does to the human mind, that state of chronic insufficiency that is nonetheless reliable? The soldiers adapted, they always do. Men learned to stretch a ration through a day. They learned to sleep in shifts so that only half would be shivering at any given moment. They created a kind of enclosed society, bound together by the understanding that they were separated from the rest of the world by a perimeter that would remain hostile until someone decided it no longer needed to be. The medical situation inside the pocket was grim in a way that official records sanitized. There was frostbite, certainly, thousands of cases, advancing from the extremities into the tissues themselves. But there was also something more subtle, the beginning of malnutrition, setting in slowly. The human body is remarkable in its adaptability, but it needs fuel, and the pocket was learning what it meant to operate on fuel that was never quite sufficient. Doctors with inadequate supplies set up aid stations in whatever buildings had not been destroyed or commandeered. A surgeon named Kurt Hoffmann kept meticulous notes of cases he treated. Gangrene was common. Amputation without anesthesia happened. The small horrors that war creates in cold climates mounted day by day. And yet there were moments of something approaching normalcy, or at least the ghost of it. Men sang, apparently. There are accounts of soldiers singing together, German songs and folk songs, their voices carrying across the frozen landscape in the clear, cold air. Someone had a harmonica. Someone else had managed to keep a deck of cards, and gambling happened, small amounts of the meager rations being wagered on card games played by lamplight or candlelight in bunkers. These acts seem almost defiant in retrospect, the assertion of humanity against the reduction of the self to mere survival. Letters and postcards moved between the pocket and the outside world by a process that still seems miraculous. Mail was collected, bundled, and flown out on transport planes returning to air bases in the rear. The Germans, even in the midst of encirclement, maintained some version of postal service. A soldier could write home, could describe, in careful, censored language, where he was and that he was alive. The letters that came back, when they came back at all, were read and reread until they fell apart, each word examined for what it might reveal about a home that felt suddenly very far away. The psychological effects of the pocket were manifold and difficult to measure. There was, at first, shock. Then, as the days accumulated into weeks, a kind of resignation settled in. The orders from Hitler were clear: hold at all costs, and the men, by and large, did hold, not because of propaganda or enthusiasm, but because orders were orders, because their comrades were beside them, because there was nowhere else to go. The encirclement paradoxically simplified some things. There was no question of retreat. There was only the daily reality of maintaining a perimeter and waiting to see what would happen next. What happened next was the sky itself. In those first hours after the realization that 100,000 men were sealed inside the Demyansk Pocket, something shifted in the upper air above the frozen landscape. The encirclement was only hours old when radio operators began crackling reports eastward toward the nearest airfields, and within a day, the question echoing through every headquarters from the Baltic to the Black Sea was deceptively simple. Could machines do what soldiers could not? Could the Luftwaffe, that gleaming instrument of the modern war, reach down through winter and keep alive an army suspended in snow? The response came not as a whispered doubt, but as a mobilization order that would set in motion one of the most audacious and ultimately most consequential experiments in aerial logistics the world had yet witnessed. Hermann Göring himself, commanding the Luftwaffe from his distant chambers, received the proposal with something approaching confidence. His pilots had performed miracles before. His transport squadrons, though never truly designed for this purpose, could be redeployed. It would be a question of mathematics and will. At least, that is what he believed in those first, almost dreamlike days of January 1942. Across the airfields of northern Russia and Poland, a quiet reorganization began. The Junkers 52 transport aircraft, that corrugated metal workhorse that had carried men and supplies since the early 1930s, became the focus of intense effort. These were not fighters. They were not bombers. They were slow, vulnerable machines with a ceiling of barely 4,600 meters and a cruising speed that seemed almost leisurely by the standards of modern warfare. Yet they were available in numbers. They were sturdy, and they could carry, when properly loaded, roughly 2.5 tons of cargo across distances that still seemed manageable on a map, though the actual journey would prove far more treacherous than any cartographer could suggest. The aircraft began to gather at forward airfields, at Pskov, at Staraya Russa, at smaller strips carved from the frozen ground where mechanics worked through the night, ensuring that engines would turn over in temperatures that seemed designed to break metal itself. Each Junkers 52 required preparation that took hours. Engines had to be heated with fires built beneath them, fuel lines had to be cleared of ice, crews had to dress in layers of wool and leather that made movement clumsy and thought even slower. But there was urgency driving all of this, an almost frantic energy that suggested men understood, perhaps without fully articulating it, that they were committing themselves to something unprecedented. The first flights attempted toward the pocket went out in conditions that were marginal at best, dangerous by any rational calculation. The corridor from the forward airfields to the improvised landing zones near Demyansk was roughly 140 kilometers, a distance that in fair weather would have been routine, but in the winter of 1942, when visibility could drop to mere meters and clouds seemed to descend directly onto the snow itself, it became a thread of possibility stretched almost to its breaking point. Pilots who had trained in sunny skies over Germany now found themselves navigating by landmarks barely visible beneath them, following rivers and railroad lines that appeared and disappeared in the shifting grey murk like half-remembered dreams. The Junkers 52s droned northward in loose formations, their wings beating the cold air with a sound that soldiers below could hear from kilometers away, a sound that grew in meaning as the weeks progressed. That sound became hope. That sound became survival. That sound became, for men huddled in frozen trenches, the thread connecting them to a world that had not abandoned them entirely. Each aircraft carried flour and salt meat, ammunition in small boxes, medical supplies wrapped in paper that grew brittle in the cold. They carried letters and newspapers from home. They carried, in a sense, the promise that the impossible might be sustained through sheer determination and industrial capacity. But consider what was actually unfolding here, beneath the narrative of heroism and ingenuity that would later accrete around these flights. The Luftwaffe was attempting something for which it had no established doctrine, no training protocols, no experience base. There was no precise calculation of how much tonnage would be required to sustain 100,000 men through a Russian winter. Supply planners offered estimates, but these were educated guesses at best, speculations made under pressure by officers who understood that admitting uncertainty might result in the pocket being abandoned, and the political consequences of that abandonment were unthinkable. So instead, they extrapolated from data they possessed about smaller operations, and they hoped that the differences would not prove catastrophic. The mathematics, when we examine them now with the benefit of hindsight and complete records, appear almost tragically inadequate. A man isolated in a combat zone, not marching, not engaged in heavy labor, but simply existing in cold, requires roughly 3,000 calories per day, more if he is to remain combat effective, more still if he is to resist the creeping hypothermia and frostbite that were as much enemies as the Soviet soldiers surrounding him. Multiply that by 100,000 by 365 days, and the number becomes almost incomprehensible. Then add fuel for heating, ammunition for defense, medical supplies for the inevitable casualties and illnesses. The Junkers 52, that sturdy workhorse, could carry perhaps 2,500 tons of supplies per day if operations proceeded without interruption. Some planners believed this might be sufficient. They said this with increasing quietness as the weeks turned into months. What emerged from the forward airfields was something unprecedented in its scale and audacity. An aerial bridge, a tentative lifeline connecting the pocket to the wider Wehrmacht through the empty winter sky. The flights became rhythmic, almost ritualistic. Dawn would break, when it broke at all, for dawn in winter near the Arctic Circle is a matter of degree rather than definition, and the engines would be fired. The aircraft would taxi across the snow-packed fields, groaning under their loads, and nose upward into the grey. Somewhere along the route, pilots would navigate by instinct and the ghost of landmarks, following the prescribed course that experience and desperate hope had established as the most reliable. They would arrive at the pocket, circle if conditions permitted, or make a single approach if cloud cover was too heavy, and drop supplies or land on one of the cleared strips. For those inside the pocket, The sound of the Junkers 52s became the rhythm of existence. Soldiers would stop what they were doing when they heard the engines. Officers would emerge from their dugouts. Men would begin to anticipate what the day would bring, not merely in terms of supplies, but in terms of the fundamental message that the aircraft carried. You have not been forgotten. You will endure. The system, whatever its fragility, will hold. The aerial bridge was born not from confidence but from necessity, not from careful planning but from the desperate improvisation of commanders trying to save a situation that their superiors had created and refused to acknowledge as untenable. And yet, in those early weeks, the flights seemed to work. The Junkers 52s came and went. The supplies accumulated in frozen dumps. The Pocket held, and in Berlin, and in the headquarters scattered across the Russian steppes, men began to believe that perhaps air power had changed the rules of warfare itself, that the older lessons about the impossibility of sustaining an encircled army in winter no longer applied. It was a dangerous belief, carefully nurtured in the weeks to come, and it would echo through decisions made in rooms far from frozen forests, decisions that would eventually lead to far greater tragedies than the men of Demyansk could possibly have imagined. Now, once the decision had been made, and it was made almost without deliberation, as these catastrophic decisions often are, the mathematics of survival began their cold work in the offices of air transport commanders scattered across occupied Ukraine and Poland. The question that presented itself in those late January days was deceptively simple, yet it contained within it the entire weight of what would follow. How many tons of supplies could actually be flown into a pocket that was, by any reasonable assessment, completely surrounded? The Junkers 52, that workhorse of German air transport, became the arithmetic's basic unit. 3 of them, lumbering through the frozen air with their corrugated metal fuselages catching what little light the winter sky offered, could theoretically carry perhaps 9 tons per sortie if everything aligned perfectly, if the weather held, if the route remained uncontested, if mechanical failure did not claim a machine before it reached its destination. 9 tons. The number hung in the minds of logisticians like a whisper that might become a scream. A single combat division, even in a defensive posture, consuming ammunition, fuel, and rations for 100,000 men, required somewhere in the neighborhood of 350 tons per day to maintain basic operations. Some estimates climbed higher still when one factored in the fuel needed to heat shelters against temperatures that routinely fell below 30 degrees Celsius. The disparity was not merely a gap, it was an abyss. And yet the calculations continued, as if numbers themselves possessed some redemptive power. If one could fly, say, 60 sorties per day, an optimistic figure that assumed perfect conditions and the availability of sufficient aircraft, one might deliver somewhere between 500 and 600 tons. There existed, in this arithmetic, the faint suggestion of plausibility, not adequacy, but survival. The margin would be thin, razor-thin, a threading of a needle while blindfolded, but it might be possible to sustain the Pocket in this manner for a time. How long a time? That depended on variables that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. Fuel was perhaps the most stubborn of these variables. The Junkers 52 drank considerable amounts of it, particularly when flying at altitude to avoid anti-aircraft fire, and the distances involved were merciless. From the forward airfield near Pskov to the makeshift landing zones being carved out of frozen lakes within the Pocket, meant flights of roughly 3 to 4 hours each way, sometimes longer depending on weather-imposed detours. A round trip consumed nearly half a ton of fuel per aircraft, fuel that itself had to be transported to the forward bases, fuel that was increasingly scarce across the entire German war machine as the strategic bombing campaigns intensified. Here, then, was the serpent swallowing its own tail. In order to supply the Pocket with fuel, One had to spend fuel that might have gone toward supplying the pocket itself. The ammunition calculations presented a different kind of despair. The two Army Corps, even in a defensive posture, even with strict conservation orders, required something in the order of 150 tons of ammunition per day to maintain even modest levels of defensive fire. To fly ammunition was to fly weight that took up precious cargo space, weight that could have been bread or preserved meat or medical supplies. Every shell delivered meant that somewhere a soldier would go without adequate food rations for one more day. Every crate of rifle cartridges meant frostbite cases would go untreated. The supply officers worked with pencils and paper, with typewriters and hand-drawn charts, creating lists and calculations that would have seemed like bureaucratic theatre had the stakes not been so monumentally real. How many men per ton of rations? How many kilometers could a soldier march on reduced calories? How many wounds could be treated without proper medicines? How many men could be lost to the cold before the remaining force became too depleted to hold even a defensive perimeter? These were the questions that threaded through the winter days in the headquarters of the airlift commands, unspoken most of the time, but present nonetheless, like frost in the air. The weather introduced what might politely be called uncertainties into the equation. Blizzards that swept across the region could ground entire squadrons for days at a time. Visibility, measured not in miles but sometimes in mere tens of meters, made navigation by visual landmarks nearly impossible. Radio navigation systems existed, but they were imperfect, and they required ground installations that had to be maintained and powered under siege conditions. Fog that clung to the frozen landscape through the short daylight hours meant that on many days, the window for flying operations lasted only a handful of hours in the middle of the day, if at all. The calendar itself became a kind of adversary. January's brutal darkness gave way slightly to February's marginally longer days, but the temperature often grew colder even as the hours of potential flying time increased. And the aircraft themselves, despite their reputation for ruggedness, were not immune to the conditions. Engines stiffened in the cold. Hydraulic systems moved sluggishly. Metal became brittle. Mechanics worked in temperatures that made their hands go numb within minutes, changing spark plugs and checking fuel lines while their breath froze white in the air. Each sortie was an act of improvisation against entropy, a brief assertion of will against the indifference of winter. The fragility of the entire enterprise became apparent only gradually, but it was present from the beginning. Every ton delivered was a ton that had required fuel to transport, had required a pilot to fly, had required a slot in a schedule that was already overcommitted. Every supply that arrived in the pocket was a supply that could not be sent to other units, other operations, other theaters of a war that continued to rage across a continent. The airlift, then, was not merely a logistical operation. It was a profound statement about priorities and choices, about what the German High Command believed was worth preserving and at what cost to everything else. In the frozen offices where these calculations were being made, in the briefing rooms where pilots received their assignments, in the supply depots where crates were stacked and weighed and loaded onto aircraft, there existed a kind of determined optimism. The mathematics, after all, suggested that it might be possible. And might be possible was all that anyone in those desperate January weeks could claim. No one could say with certainty that it would fail. No one, as they looked at the pencil marks on paper, could prove that the airlift was impossible. Yet even as the machines began their labored flight across that frozen wilderness, nature itself emerged as perhaps the most merciless antagonist the pocket would face. The winter of 1942 in northwestern Russia was not simply cold. It was a presence that seemed to possess intention, a force that pressed down upon every human and mechanical effort with relentless, suffocating weight. The temperatures dropped to 20, 30, sometimes 40 degrees below 0°C. And in such extremes, the distinction between survival and death became measured in minutes rather than hours. The Luftwaffe pilots who flew those transport runs, many of them young men barely into their 20s, drawn from training schools across Germany just months before, had never encountered conditions of this severity. They would climb into the cockpits of their Junkers 52s, those venerable, slow-moving aircraft that had become the backbone of the airlift, and face a sky that seemed actively hostile. Blizzards would obscure the landscape below without warning, transforming familiar routes into white mazes where orientation became impossible. A pilot might begin his descent toward the frozen landing strips inside the pocket, with landmarks visible, only to find, within minutes, that the entire world had vanished into swirling snow and grey murk. The fog deserves mention alongside the snow, for in the peculiar climate of that region, fog would settle across the forests and frozen lakes with a density that made even low-altitude flying extraordinarily dangerous. Imagine descending through clouds so thick that you cannot see the wings of your own aircraft, guided only by instinct and the faint memory of where a landing strip ought to be. Radio communication was primitive, unreliable in the extreme cold, and so pilots flew often in near-complete isolation, trusting to their instruments and prayer in equal measure. How many times did crews abort approaches, circling back toward friendly territory with full loads of supplies, unable to locate the pocket through the murk? There are no precise records, but the accounts suggest it happened far more frequently than official histories tend to acknowledge. The cold itself became a mechanical antagonist. The engines of the Junkers 52, robust as they were, suffered in these temperatures. Oil would thicken, batteries would lose their charge, hydraulic systems would freeze, making even simple operations sluggish and uncertain. Ground crews working outside the aircraft, soldiers and mechanics bundled in whatever layers they could scavenge, would work for perhaps 20 minutes before frostbite made their fingers numb enough that they could no longer grip tools. Many accounts describe these men rotating off duty, not because their shift had ended, but because they had begun to lose sensation in their extremities, and hypothermia was becoming a real danger. Within the pocket itself, the conditions for those receiving supplies were scarcely less dire. The airstrips had to be prepared and maintained by men who were already malnourished, who were sleeping in frozen dugouts and trenches, who rarely felt genuine warmth. These ground crews would work in blizzards to clear snow from runways, to mark approach paths with whatever materials they could spare, to assist in unloading aircraft before they had to depart again. The mortality rate from cold-related illness and injury within the pocket may never be precisely known, but testimonies suggest that frostbite was endemic, that men were losing fingers, toes, and noses to the elements as surely as they were being lost to Soviet bullets. There is something quietly devastating about recognizing that in many cases, the winter was a more effective killer than combat itself. A soldier might survive weeks of intermittent artillery bombardment and small arms fire, only to succumb to pneumonia, to gangrene from an untreated wound that froze and blackened, or simply to the progressive weakening of a body that was never warm enough and never had enough food. The psychological toll of such conditions cannot be overestimated either. Soldiers wrote letters home, letters that would take weeks to reach their destinations, if they arrived at all, describing a state of numb resignation, a sense that they were being killed not by an enemy, but by geography and season. The Soviet forces surrounding the pocket were themselves suffering from the cold, yet they had certain advantages. Their supply lines, stretched though they were, could be replenished from the vast resources of the Soviet Union. They rotated troops more regularly, though this practice varied considerably depending on the unit's distance from supply depots. More importantly, many of the Soviet soldiers, particularly those from regions east of the Urals, had experience with extreme cold that many German troops simply did not possess. A man raised in Siberia possessed an almost unconscious understanding of how to survive such temperatures. He knew instinctively when to stop moving, when to find shelter, how to preserve his body's heat. This intimate knowledge, passed down through generations and across cultures, became a form of capital in the brutal mathematics of winter warfare. The fog that rolled across the frozen lakes where pilots attempted to land their aircraft created particular difficulties because it would appear and disappear with almost capricious timing. A route that had been navigable at dawn might become impassable by mid-morning, then clear again by afternoon, only to close once more as dusk approached. This unpredictability meant that airlift operations could never achieve the kind of routine scheduling that military logistics demanded. A transport pilot might be ordered to fly a mission one day, only to find the weather had changed so radically that the order was countermanded just hours before takeoff. The cumulative effect of such disruption was a constant tension, a sense that no plan could be relied upon, that nature might at any moment render all strategic calculations meaningless. And perhaps there was a strange mercy in this. The cold, the fog, the blizzards, they were no respecters of rank, no more fearful of German uniforms or Soviet insignia than they were of the frozen earth itself. They operated according to their own logic, indifferent to the political designs of distant leaders, to the ambitions of generals, to the lives of men far below. In that indifference lay something almost restful, a reminder that human will, however forcefully asserted, would always encounter limits written in ice and wind and the turning of seasons. Yet the Soviets, watching this fragile lifeline of transport planes weaving through the winter darkness, understood precisely what it meant. They had their own advantages in the frozen landscape: numbers, proximity, and an intimate knowledge of terrain that no map could fully convey to the German commanders studying situation reports from distant headquarters. The Soviet Northwestern Front, under General Ivan Komev, possessed something the encircled Germans did not: the ability to move freely across the frozen wastes, to mass forces where they chose, to press inward from multiple directions simultaneously. And so they began, methodically and with the patience that characterizes operations conducted in such silence and cold, to search for weaknesses in the perimeter. They probed the southern rim of the pocket first, where the ground rose slightly and where German positions, thinly held by exhausted men, seemed most vulnerable to concentrated assault. The fighting around the southern sector took on a grinding, attritional quality that winter, each day bleeding into the next with little apparent progress on either side. Soviet rifle divisions would mass and attack, pushing forward across open snow where every advance cost lives, knowing that behind them their own supply lines stretched thin across the frozen earth. The Germans, constrained within their shrinking perimeter, could not afford to give ground without consequence. Every kilometer surrendered meant the noose tightening, the airlift corridors growing slightly shorter, the fields where transport planes could land becoming more vulnerable to artillery fire. It was a mathematics of desperation on both sides, though the Soviets could absorb losses in ways the Germans could not. To lose 1,000 men was catastrophic for a pocket already rationing food and ammunition. For the Red Army's massive reserves, it was tragic but sustainable, a cost factored into operational planning with grim acceptance. What neither side fully anticipated, though, was the possibility of something between complete encirclement and total breakout, a narrow thread of connection that might somehow, improbably, remain open to the frozen ground behind German lines. As January progressed into February and Soviet attacks intensified along the eastern approaches, German commanders began to conceive of a desperate experiment. What if, they reasoned, a narrow corridor could be punched through the Soviet lines from outside the pocket? What if relief forces, concentrated and coordinated, could maintain not a supply line of food and ammunition flowing inward, but rather a slender passage of land where men themselves might eventually be evacuated, or at minimum, where local supply could supplement the dying airlift. The operation, as eventually conceived, focused on a region called Ramushevo, a desolate cluster of snow-covered buildings and frozen marshes roughly 20 kilometers southeast of the pocket's main body. It was here that German forces gathered. Ex-Lowy Panzer Corps, under General von Arnim, already depleted from months of fighting, began to assemble and prepare for what amounted to a breakthrough operation in miniature. They would not attempt to shatter the entire Soviet encirclement. That was beyond their strength. Instead, they would concentrate overwhelming force at a single point, bash through, and create a corridor narrow enough to hold against Soviet counterattack, but wide enough to allow for the passage of supplies and, eventually, if necessary, the withdrawal of irreplaceable troops and equipment. The fighting that emerged from this plan, around the Ramushevo approach in late February 1942, was fierce in a localized, terrible way. German panzer grenadiers and tank crews, many of them veterans of the deep Russian campaigns, attacked through snow and Soviet defensive positions with a ferocity born of desperation. They were, after all, fighting not to gain territory, but to preserve the existence of 100,000 men trapped in a contracting space. The Soviets defended with equal determination, recognizing the stakes, throwing counterattacks against the German spearhead, even as the Germans surged forward in a violent, costly ballet of advance and consolidation. What emerged, almost by accident, was something like success, not triumph, but a narrow breach that somehow held. By early March, a corridor perhaps 3 to 5 kilometers in width had been established, creating a thin land bridge between the outside world and the trapped pocket. It was a fragile thing, subject to constant Soviet pressure, requiring continuous reinforcement and guard duty, consuming resources that the encircled forces could scarcely afford, but it existed. It was physical proof that the pocket was not utterly severed from German-controlled territory, that supplies could move along its length, and that the nightmare of absolute encirclement had, if only marginally, been postponed. Yet here lay a profound ambiguity, something that haunted German commanders and would echo through the decisions they would make in months to come. The corridor was narrow, vulnerable, and ultimately secondary to the Luftwaffe's airlift operations. It could not transport the massive tonnages that the air bridge, at its best moments, could deliver, but it existed as a psychological fact of enormous importance. It meant that the pocket was not a closed universe unto itself. It meant that the seemingly impossible, maintaining an encircled force indefinitely through some combination of air supply and ground corridor, had been achieved, at least in miniature, at least for now. German officers could write reports suggesting that the Demyansk situation, however dire on its surface, was actually manageable. Relief forces could be brought forward. The fortress could be held. Breakout was unnecessary. The human cost of creating this corridor would never be fully calculated, though the numbers were surely in the tens of thousands. Soviet losses, German losses, the accumulated suffering of men fighting in temperatures that froze the breath in their lungs. Supply trucks began, tentatively, to move along its length. Field kitchens were established at various points along the route. Wounded men were evacuated through it, moving from the nightmarish conditions inside the pocket toward field hospitals in the rear. The airlift continued overhead, its droning engines a constant presence in the frozen sky, but the corridor became, in the minds of those responsible for the pocket's defense, something approaching redemption. It transformed the situation from absolute encirclement into something more complex, more ambiguous, more susceptible to the interpretation that catastrophe had been averted through the will and ingenuity of German military leadership. Within that frozen enclosure, thousands of men existed in states we struggle now to imagine. They were not merely units plotted on maps by distant strategists. They were individuals whose letters, brief diary entries, and the testimony of their comrades have survived the decades to whisper across time, small voices calling us to remember not abstractions but faces, names, particular human griefs. Consider the men of 2 Army Corps itself, the backbone of the pocket. General Adolf Strauss commanded them, a figure often overshadowed by more famous generals, yet a man of cautious competence who came to see the futility of his situation with increasing clarity as the weeks compressed into months. His correspondence reveals a quiet anguish, a steady professional watching supply calculations dwindle like the light itself. Strauss was not a firebrand. He was methodical, almost pedestrian in his way, which made his growing conviction that the pocket was becoming a tomb all the more damning. He would eventually advocate for breakout, even as Hitler's messages grew more absolute, more demanding, more disconnected from the reality his eyes could see. Below him moved men like the officers of the 18th Motorized Division, some of them in their early 20s, many barely older than 25, commanding platoons of exhausted soldiers in positions that seemed to shift and freeze and shift again with each passing day. One such officer, Lieutenant Karl Becker, a name now largely absent from the histories, yet a man who kept a small leather journal through much of the siege, wrote entries that have the weight of direct observation. He noted, with neither drama nor self-pity, the state of his men's feet. Frostbite was not a statistical problem for him. It was Schmidt who could no longer feel his toes. It was Hoffman, whose fingers had gone black and who had to be held as he wept. Becker's pencil notes, made in what must have been the deepest cold of February, described checking each man methodically, counting functional boots, calculating how many could still walk if the order came to move. The mathematics of survival through his eyes was terrifyingly intimate. The engineers of the 290th Division, tasked with maintaining the defensive perimeter and improvising shelter against temperatures that fell beyond -30 degrees, developed a grim expertise in the architecture of cold. They built shelters from whatever debris the frozen forest offered, timber, canvas, packed snow itself, which they learned insulated better than one might suppose. One sergeant, whose account reached us through a post-war interview, described the process with the tone of a craftsman discussing his work. They would dig down into the snow, he explained, not up. The earth below retained fractional warmth. They would line the walls with dried moss and straw, scrounged from abandoned settlements. They would create what amounted to underground chambers, cave-like, where men could sit shoulder to shoulder and share the minimal warmth of their own bodies. It was a science born of desperation. It kept men alive in conditions that should have killed them wholesale. The pilots and crews of the Luftwaffe transport squadrons deserve their own quiet mention. They were not combat pilots in the conventional sense, though they faced genuine danger with every flight. Many were older men, veterans of the Polish campaign or the French campaign, reassigned to transport duties as the war ground on. A pilot named Helmuth Werner, documented in squadron records and in a brief memoir written after the war, flew his Junkers 52 into the pocket's improvised airfields again and again through that winter. His logbook, preserved in an archive, shows the numbing repetition of his work. Flight after flight into conditions he knew grew worse. Into a pocket he understood was doomed, carrying supplies he knew were never quite sufficient, knowing that men depended on his steadiness and his willingness to push forward into fog that obscured the landing zone, into crosswinds that threatened to flip his unwieldy aircraft. The soldiers themselves left traces too, though most were not writers, not men accustomed to recording their thoughts. Yet some did. A private named Gustav Reinhardt, serving with an anti-tank company, managed to send letters out during one period when the encirclement was not yet entirely sealed. Those letters, kept by his sister and eventually donated to a military museum, speak with the quiet realism of a man watching his situation worsen day by day. He describes the work of digging gun positions in frozen ground. He mentions a friend from his hometown who had frozen to death during the first night of the counteroffensive. He does not rage against it. He simply states it, as though writing it down makes it somehow real, somehow bearable. In one letter, he asks his sister whether she has received his earlier correspondence. There is a fragile hope in the question. Perhaps if letters are getting through, he seems to reason, then we might also get out. Not all the commanders were resigned or thoughtful in the way Strauss and Becker appear to have been. Colonel Friedrich Wilhelm, commanding an artillery regiment within the Pocket, earned himself a reputation among his men for maintaining not just discipline, but morale through sheer force of personality. He was, by accounts left by subordinates, a man who could speak to a group of exhausted soldiers and somehow convince them that their suffering had meaning, that they were holding something important, that their sacrifice was being noted. Whether this was cruelty dressed as leadership or genuine compassion remains unclear across the decades. But his men remembered him. They spoke of him after the war with a complex mixture of respect and bitterness. He had believed the promises, he had transmitted them, and in the end, those promises had meant nothing. The medical personnel and chaplains occupy a particular space in the testimony from within the Pocket. A doctor named Jakob Stern, whose records have been documented, worked in what amounted to a frozen bunker serving as the Pocket's primary medical station. He amputated frostbitten limbs with saws meant for butchering. He treated dysentery and typhus, and wounds that could not heal, because the human body, when starved and frozen, loses its capacity to repair itself. His diary, made in small notations on scraps of paper, consists largely of tallies: the number treated, the number who died, the number who had to be sent back to duty despite their condition, because the Pocket could not afford to lose even those barely capable of standing. There is a strange numbness in his recorded observations, not cruelty, but the emotional armor that develops when the problem is too large to process as individual tragedy. The Soviet commanders pressing the encirclement maintained their own perspectives, of course. General Ivan Konev, commanding the Northwestern Front, sent constant signals for the assault to be pressed, for the noose to tighten faster, for the Pocket to be fully destroyed. His orders were logical from a military standpoint. They made sound strategic sense. Yet they describe a pattern that would echo across the Eastern Front again and again: the attempt to annihilate, to bring the enemy to absolute surrender rather than negotiate, rather than accept the exhaustion of both sides. How many Soviet soldiers died assaulting those frozen positions? The German defenders, even starving, even freezing, were skilled fighters in fortified ground. The casualty ratios favored the defenders. This is the mathematics of the Eastern Front at its most brutal: the human cost of attempting to destroy rather than merely defeat an enemy. What emerges from these voices, these fragments of testimony and documentation, is not a clear heroic narrative or a simple tragedy. It is something more complex and more human. It is the picture of tens of thousands of individuals, officers and enlisted men, pilots and doctors, engineers and soldiers, each confronting an impossible situation with their own small resources of will, competence, faith, or resignation. The commanders made decisions that had cascading consequences they could not fully foresee. The soldiers endured, or did not endure, with a quiet persistence that asks no applause. The doctors saved what lives could be saved. The pilots flew again and again into danger, because that was their duty, though it grew increasingly clear that duty and survival were not the same thing, that loyalty to orders and loyalty to one's men could move in opposite directions. By the winter of 1942, Something remarkable seemed to be unfolding in the frozen pockets between Moscow and Leningrad. The aircraft kept coming, day after day. Through the worst weather imaginable, transport planes descended through the clouds carrying supplies, flour, ammunition, medicine, fuel. The Germans inside the pocket were not starving, they were holding, and to those watching from Berlin, from the headquarters of Army Group North, from Hitler's own war rooms, the airlift began to feel less like improvisation and more like vindication. Perhaps, the thinking went, the Luftwaffe had discovered something new. Perhaps air power could do what seemed impossible. Perhaps an army could survive, indefinitely, cut off from the rest of the world. But what the numbers whispered, when examined in the quiet hours before dawn, told a different story entirely. Consider the mathematics of hunger. A soldier in the field requires roughly 2,000 calories daily just to maintain his strength in ordinary conditions. In a Russian winter, fighting in trenches carved from permafrost, sleeping in dugouts where water freezes in buckets, a man needs 3,000 or more. The Demyansk airlift, at its peak, managed to deliver roughly 200 tons per day. When you divide that across 100,000 soldiers, when you account for the fuel that must be transported to power, the vehicles that distribute supplies, when you calculate the ammunition needed to hold a perimeter many kilometers long, the mathematics becomes something closer to scarcity, wearing a mask of adequacy. They were not starving, no, but they were never quite satisfied. The bread ration grew thinner, the soup grew more watery. Frostbite began to claim fingers and toes, not because of cold alone, but because undernourished bodies lose their resistance to the cold more quickly. And there was another cost, one that appeared in the casualty lists rather than the supply ledgers. The Luftwaffe pilots flying these missions were not remote from the reality of the pocket. Each descent into the frozen landing zones was a gauntlet. Soviet fighters prowled the skies. Anti-aircraft guns dug into the snow waited for the slow, lumbering shapes of the transport planes. A Junkers 52, that workhorse of the airlift, could carry perhaps 3 tons of cargo if everything was perfect. It could also carry 30 or more soldiers on a return flight, wounded men, or those deemed too ill to continue fighting. But every flight was a gamble. The losses accumulated silently, almost politely, in reports filed at distant airfields. By the time the pocket finally opened, in late April of 1942, the Luftwaffe had lost somewhere between 200 and 300 aircraft to maintain the airlift. That is not a small number. That is a fleet. That is the entire operational capacity of an air force under tremendous strain. The soldiers inside the pocket, of course, experienced success in its simplest form. They were alive. They were still fighting. The Soviet armies surrounding them had not broken through. In letters home, which survive in archives across Germany, men express a kind of cautious relief. The worst had not happened. They speak of the sound of the aircraft engines with something approaching affection, the distant drone becoming a sign that the outside world had not abandoned them. There is gratitude in these letters, genuine and moving. The airlift saved their lives. That is a fact that cannot be diminished. Yet from the perspective of the larger war, from the vantage point of those making decisions about where armies would be positioned and whether encirclement was survivable, something more dangerous was crystallizing. A myth was forming. The Demyansk Pocket had proven, or so it appeared, that the impossible was merely difficult. An army of over 100,000 men had been surrounded, and the surrounding armies had not crushed them. The Luftwaffe had sustained them through the worst winter Russia could produce. And in the spring, when the snows melted and the frozen earth became passable again, the pocket was finally relieved. A corridor was forced open. The army escaped. What was not widely circulated, what was somehow lost in the reporting and the analysis, was the true price of that escape. The Sea Army Corps that walked out of the Demyansk Pocket in the spring of 1942 was not the same force that had been surrounded the previous winter. It had been diminished in spirit and in strength. Nearly 30,000 soldiers never walked out. They remained in the frozen ground, or they lay in field hospitals far to the rear, their bodies ravaged by exposure and malnutrition and disease. The unit's combat effectiveness was so reduced that it would take months of reconstitution before it could fight effectively again. But these details, somehow, were less memorable than the headline. The airlift had worked. An encircled army had been rescued. The Luftwaffe had proven its worth. This was the narrative that took shape in the minds of Hitler and his closest advisors. And here lies the danger, the subtle and terrible danger, in a story that looks like triumph. When a risky strategy appears to succeed, when it works against odds and expectation, there is a powerful human tendency to assume it will work again. The mind forgets the narrowness of the margin. It forgets the months of frantic effort and near-constant crisis. It forgets that success and disaster often wear nearly identical faces. It remembers only the victory, and it begins to plan the next battle with that memory as guide, that assumption as foundation. The Demyansk airlift succeeded, but only barely. It succeeded because the pocket was relatively small, because the weather occasionally cooperated, because the Soviet forces surrounding it, while numerous, were not sufficiently coordinated or supplied to deliver a knockout blow. It succeeded because the distance from rear airfields to the pocket was manageable, because the Luftwaffe, though strained, still had enough transport capacity and enough pilot skill to maintain some level of supply. It succeeded because the German commanders inside the pocket, though desperate, managed to hold the perimeter against sustained pressure. But success under extreme conditions, achieved through near-miraculous effort and acceptance of horrific costs, is not a replicable formula. It is not a doctrine. It is not something upon which you can build a strategy for a war that requires winning on multiple fronts, against enemies that are growing stronger, with resources that are growing thinner. And yet, in the months that followed, in the planning rooms of the High Command, that is precisely what began to happen. The Demyansk airlift became proof. It became precedent. It became the answer to the question of whether an army could survive surrounded, and the answer seemed, to those not burdened by the details, to be yes. The frozen pocket, with its 100,000 soldiers, its desperate pilots, its soldiers who ate thin rations and endured unimaginable cold, had created something in the German High Command's imagination that would prove far more consequential than anyone could have foreseen. It had created confidence in an illusion. In the months following the Demyansk evacuation, something shifted fundamentally in the thinking of Adolf Hitler and those few voices he still truly listened to. The pocket had held, against the predictions of skeptics, against the grinding pressure of Soviet arms. Those 100,000 soldiers had not been lost to enemy action or their own desperation. They had endured through winter by means of the air, and that fact, that singular, almost miraculous fact, began to take on a weight in Hitler's mind that grew with each retelling, each briefing, each report filtered through the lens of those who wished to tell him what he wanted to hear. You might wonder what exactly made Demyansk seem, in those long winter nights at the Wolf's Lair, like a validation of something larger than itself. It was partly the sheer improbability of it all. An encircled army, supplied by Junkers 52s, that rattled through blizzards like tin insects, fed by mathematics that shouldn't have worked, held by will alone. The Luftwaffe had delivered enough. Not comfort, not abundance, but enough. Enough to keep rifles in German hands, enough to maintain fighting strength, enough that the pocket could be defended and eventually relieved. This was the seed from which a dangerous conviction would grow. Hitler had always possessed a peculiar relationship with air power. He understood its propaganda value, its dramatic capacity to reshape the battlefield in ways that cavalry or artillery could not. But Demyansk suggested something more seductive still, that the Luftwaffe might serve as a kind of invisible hand, a means by which geography itself could be negated. If you held the sky, if you commanded enough transport capacity, then distance became almost theoretical. Encirclement became merely a temporary condition, a tactical inconvenience rather than a strategic catastrophe. The pocket at Demyansk had proven this, or so the logic ran, in the minds of those who wished it to be proven. What followed was a quiet reordering of assumptions. In strategy sessions that stretched into the early mornings, when exhaustion and desperation sometimes created the conditions for clearer thinking, and sometimes the opposite, Hitler began to speak of encirclements differently. They were no longer disasters to be prevented at all costs. They were opportunities. They were tests of will. They were, perhaps most dangerously, expendable assets that could be written off as necessary losses if the larger strategic vision demanded it. The pocket had become, in effect, a proof of concept for a doctrine that existed mostly in the realm of hope and rhetoric, and the psychology of a command structure that had begun to lose its grip on reality. Among the generals and officers who had witnessed Demyansk firsthand, reactions were mixed, though few dared voice skepticism in forums where Hitler might hear it. Some understood clearly that the airlift had succeeded only because the pocket was relatively small, only because the Luftwaffe had managed to concentrate enough transport capacity, only because the distances involved, while daunting, were not impossible. They grasped, with the kind of professional clarity that comes from long military experience, that conditions like these might not be replicable. But these cautionary voices were increasingly isolated, drowned out by the triumphalism that began to emanate from the very top of the command structure. Göring, the Reichsmarschall of the Luftwaffe, had stakes in all of this. He had promised that air supply was possible. He had delivered, or seemed to have delivered. His prestige, already somewhat fragile, had been restored by Demyansk. When Hitler now asked him whether the Luftwaffe could sustain an encircled army, whether air transport might serve as a permanent solution to the problem of forward-deployed forces cut off from supply routes, Göring found it increasingly difficult to say no. He had proven it could be done once. To say it could not be done again would be to contradict the evidence of recent history, or at least the version of recent history that circulated in Hitler's circle. The consequences of this psychological shift were profound, though they rippled outward slowly. It meant that in future operations, encirclement became less something to fear and more something to accept as a manageable risk. It meant that Hitler could order his armies to hold ground without withdrawal, to dig in, to maintain position regardless of the tactical situation unfolding around them, because there would always, theoretically, be the air bridge. It meant that the calculation of acceptable losses shifted. If a pocket could be sustained by air, if relief could come by air, then the price of holding that position, even if it seemed catastrophic in conventional military terms, might be worth paying. Consider for a moment the perspective of a junior staff officer tasked with logistics planning. He would have had access to the real numbers from Demyansk. He would have understood the razor's margin by which success had been achieved, the countless flights that barely squeaked through, the supplies that fell short of minimum thresholds, the wounded who could not be evacuated because transport capacity was consumed by ammunition and rations. He would have known, with the kind of certainty that comes from working with actual data, that the airlift had succeeded not because it was a sustainable system, but because it had limped along just barely above the threshold of total collapse. Yet the narrative that rose from these same numbers, when they passed through the filters of command and ambition and the human tendency to see what we wish to see, told a different story entirely. It became a story of triumph, of capability proven, of problems solved. What makes this transformation of understanding particularly striking is how quickly it calcified into doctrine. Within months of the Demyansk evacuation, the concept of the fortress began to gain official sanction. An encircled force was not a defeated force, not necessarily. It was a fortress, a redoubt, a place that would hold because it was ordered to hold, because holding served the larger strategy, because the Luftwaffe would ensure that surrender was unnecessary. The language shifted, the assumptions shifted, and the German High Command found itself increasingly committed to a strategic vision that would, within a matter of months, lead to one of the most catastrophic decisions of the entire war. The airlift at Demyansk had been a feat of logistics and determination and luck, roughly equal parts. But it had been misread, or rather, it had been read in the way that served the immediate political and psychological needs of those in power. It had been transformed, in the telling, into something more than it was. And in that transformation lay the seeds of Stalingrad. The pocket that seemed to validate the promise of air supply would become the template, the precedent, the historical justification for an even larger, more elaborate, far more demanding attempt at the same strategy. The chain of causation is not perfectly linear, of course, but it is real nonetheless. Demyansk taught Hitler something he wished to believe, and the price of that lesson would be paid by hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the months to come. The winter of 1942 and 1943 would scatter pockets across the Eastern Front, like scattered beads on a darkened map, and each one carried within it a peculiar echo of Demyansk's logic. To understand what happened next, how a single successful airlift would reshape German strategy for the entire Eastern campaign, we might linger for a moment on the psychology of pockets themselves, on what they meant in the minds of commanders who were increasingly desperate to hold on to territory they could no longer defend through movement and maneuver. Consider the Kulm Pocket, which formed roughly at the same moment as Demyansk, perhaps 100 kilometers to the south, where nearly 11,000 German troops found themselves surrounded by Soviet forces across the frozen wetlands. The garrison there, under Colonel Friedrich Siebert, was much smaller and more isolated, yet the principle was identical. Hitler forbade withdrawal. The Luftwaffe attempted resupply. For months, the Ju-52s rumbled through bitter skies, dropping supplies into that frozen hell, until eventually a relief force broke through and the pocket was evacuated. Success, another victory whispered through the corridors of headquarters, another proof that air power could accomplish what seemed impossible. But here is where the mind's eye becomes dangerous, where the lessons of war begin to mutate into something else entirely. When Kulm held, when Demyansk held, when supplies trickled down from the sky and surrounded men survived, a profound psychological shift occurred in German high command. It was not merely that these pockets had been successful, though they had, at least temporarily. It was that they had succeeded despite everything that military logic suggested should happen. They violated the classical principles of warfare. A surrounded force should either break out or be destroyed. That was the ancient rule. Yet here were surrounded forces, completely cut off from any land connection, surviving month after month through aerial resupply alone. This seemed to unlock something in Hitler's mind, something that had perhaps always been latent, but now found justification in fact. If the Luftwaffe could sustain a pocket of 11,000 men, why not 100,000? Why not garrison cities as fortresses, sink roots deep into conquered territory, and let the air arm keep them alive while ground forces regrouped and counterattacked? The doctrine that emerged from this reasoning would come to be called the Festung principle, the fortress concept, and it would weave itself into German strategic thinking with almost religious conviction. The seduction of this idea lay partly in its appeal to German strengths. The Wehrmacht had been built for rapid maneuver, for the fluid operations of blitzkrieg. But as 1942 progressed and the war deepened, as casualties mounted and the reserves of trained soldiers began to dwindle, the prospect of holding fixed positions, defensible terrain, became increasingly attractive. A fortress required no brilliant commanders, no swift tactical movements, no superiority in numbers. It required only discipline, supplies, and faith. A fortress was democratic. It could hold as long as supplies came and soldiers obeyed. Yet, there were other pockets that should have whispered warnings into this optimistic haze, and we might wonder now whether anyone truly listened. The story of Schlüsselburg, besieged on the shores of Lake Ladoga near Leningrad, was far grimmer. The garrison there endured starvation, disease, and psychic disintegration for months, supplied initially by air, but ultimately by a perilous ice road that required constant fighting to maintain. The men who survived spoke of things that should have haunted the conscience of any strategist: the quiet death by hunger, the way flesh withered and minds grew thin. Yet even this horror could be reframed in the language of success. The fortress had held. Germany still controlled the position. The soldiers, whatever they suffered, had obeyed orders until relief came. This was the great confusion at the heart of German strategy. Holding had become synonymous with survival, and the fact that survival came at an almost unimaginable human cost seemed somehow beside the point. The ledger was kept in territory and positions, not in human life. And when the Luftwaffe's transports successfully delivered supplies to a surrounded garrison, this was recorded as victory, not as the expensive and temporary mitigation of catastrophe that it actually was. Historians and strategists have long debated why this lesson, that temporary success creates false confidence, was so poorly understood by the German command. Perhaps it was because the alternative was unthinkable. To admit that pockets could not be sustained indefinitely would require acknowledging that the war was already lost, that Germany could no longer maneuver, could no longer achieve victory through operational art, could only cling to territory and hope that time itself would change circumstances that time was making worse. It was easier to believe in the Luftwaffe's miraculous powers, easier to see Demyansk and Holm as harbingers of a new way of waging war, one in which air power and discipline could substitute for all other forms of military strength. And so a myth was born in that winter, quietly and almost unnoticed even by those who shaped it. It was the myth of the sustainable pocket, the myth that surrounded forces need not despair, the myth that the Luftwaffe could perform any miracle if only the political will held firm. This myth would spread from planning staff to planning staff, from general to general. It would become embedded in the very language of command, in the orders that men wrote and the orders that men obeyed. When a commander spoke of holding a position, he was no longer speaking merely of military defense. He was invoking a new principle, that courage and discipline and air supply could overcome any tactical disadvantage. What made this so potent, perhaps, was that it seemed to rest on solid ground. It was not pure fantasy. The pockets had genuinely held. Supplies had genuinely been delivered through the sky. Men had genuinely survived who, by all rights, should have perished. This was not delusion in the clinical sense. It was faith based on evidence, hope anchored to fact. And that made it far more dangerous than any obvious madness could have been, because no one could easily point to it and call it folly. The other pockets that would form and dissolve across the vast landscape of the Eastern Front would all carry this weight of accumulated assumption. Even as the geography changed, as the scope of encirclements grew larger and the Luftwaffe's resources grew thinner, as the distances stretched and the weather worsened, the belief persisted. Demyansk had held. Therefore, anything could hold. Therefore, fortresses were the way forward. It would take the full and terrible weight of Stalingrad to finally shatter this conviction, and even then, the shattering would not be complete. By the spring of 1942, as the snow melted from the Russian steppes and the Demyansk Pocket remained stubbornly, impossibly intact, a peculiar transformation had begun in the minds of those who commanded Germany's vast armies. The airlift had worked, against the skeptics, against the obvious laws of logistics, against the brutal arithmetic that should have spelled catastrophe for 100,000 men cut off in the frozen lake country the airlift had held. And this success, quiet and tentative as it was, had planted a seed in the strategic imagination of Hitler and his closest military advisors, a seed that would grow into something far larger and more dangerous than anyone in those spring planning sessions fully understood. In the concrete bunkers of East Prussia, in the map rooms where young staff officers moved unit markers across the vast expanse of Russia, the narrative had begun to shift. Before Demyansk, there had been a certain orthodoxy among military planners, an unspoken rule that surrounded armies, cut off and isolated, must either break out or perish. It was a principle born from centuries of warfare, confirmed by the logic of supply chains and the finite capacity of men to survive without food, ammunition, and fuel. But Demyansk had seemingly written a new chapter to that old story. If 600 tons could be flown into a pocket daily, if Junkers 52s, slow and vulnerable as they were, could thread the needle of Soviet anti-aircraft fire and deliver enough sustenance to keep an army whole, then perhaps the rules had changed. Perhaps air power had fundamentally altered what was possible on the Eastern Front. This was not, it should be said, an explicit admission or a formal doctrine pronounced from on high. Rather, it was something more insidious, a quiet confidence that took root in conversations, in the margins of operational orders, in the way certain possibilities that had been dismissed months earlier were now entertained without the same reflexive resistance. When Hitler spoke to his generals in the spring and early summer of 1942, as the Wehrmacht prepared for its great summer offensive toward the Caucasus and the oil fields of Baku, there was a different tenor to the discussions about what might happen if an army found itself surrounded. The Führer had become, in the view of some historians, almost intoxicated by the success of the Demyansk precedent. Here was proof, he believed, that National Socialist determination could overcome logistical impossibility, that willpower and air transport could sustain what conventional thinking said must fail. The tragedy of this moment, the thing that would haunt the Eastern Front for the remainder of the war, was that no one in those strategy meetings had truly reckoned with the full cost of what Demyansk had demanded. The airlift, yes, had succeeded in keeping the pocket alive, but at what price? The Luftwaffe had strained itself to the breaking point. Pilots were exhausted, aircraft were wearing out, fuel reserves were being consumed at rates that could not be indefinitely sustained. The airlift had worked not because the Luftwaffe possessed some miraculous excess capacity, but because for several months, German air commanders had essentially mortgaged their future to maintain it. They had flown until engines were threadbare, had risked aircraft on every flight that by conventional standards should have been retired from service, and in doing so, they had depleted resources and worn out machines that would be desperately needed elsewhere. But these realities, these hard costs written in lost hours and burned fuel and the pale faces of pilots flying their 10th mission in a day, these were not the realities that seized the imagination of the high command. What seized them was the image of success, the photograph in the mind of an army saved by air power, of logistics transcended by determination. And it was this image, this dangerous half-truth, that would be carried forward into the summer and autumn of 1942, as new offensives were planned, new possibilities entertained. The atmosphere in these planning sessions, so we can gather from the surviving records and the memoirs of those who participated, had shifted toward a kind of strategic optimism that was not entirely justified. When operational plans were drafted for the advance toward Stalingrad, when the massive converging offensives in southern Russia were being coordinated, there was an assumption woven through them, sometimes explicit and sometimes merely implicit, that the Luftwaffe could be called upon, once again, to perform miracles of supply. If it had done so at Demyansk, why not again? If air transport could sustain one pocket, why not another, larger perhaps, deeper within enemy territory? The generals and staff officers who asked these questions were not fools, but they were men who had seen something that appeared to confirm what their supreme commander wanted to believe. And in the totalitarian apparatus of Nazi Germany, this was a dangerous combination indeed. Goering himself, the Reichsmarschall and commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, had every reason to view the Demyansk airlift with satisfaction. It had vindicated his arm of the service in a way that few other operations had. It had demonstrated that air power was not merely a tool of offense and defense, but a fundamental instrument of army supply, of strategic maneuver. And when Hitler, in the confidence that Demyansk's success had engendered, asked his questions about what might be sustained by air in the future, Goering's answers were less cautious than they perhaps should have been. The Reichsmarschall promised again, and continued to promise, often without fully comprehending the gap between what was theoretically possible and what could actually be sustained when operations reached a scale larger than anything previously attempted. By late summer of 1942, as the German armies swept southward toward the Volga and toward Stalingrad, this assumption had hardened into something approaching doctrine. The possibility of encirclement was no longer viewed with the same dread that it might have been before. If an army were surrounded, well, the Luftwaffe would maintain it. This was not explicitly stated in most operational orders, but it hovered in the background of calculations, a comforting presence that made certain risks seem more acceptable than they might otherwise have been. And it was Demyansk, above all, that had made this comfort possible. And so it was that in the autumn months of 1942, as the Demyansk airlift continued its fragile work above the frozen forests, the German command had begun to construct a dangerous narrative in their minds. They had convinced themselves, or allowed themselves to be convinced, that air power had transcended its traditional limitations. They had watched supplies descend from grey skies onto desperate men, had seen encircled armies endure when all logic suggested they could not, and from this costly success they drew a conclusion that would echo with terrible consequences across the steppes. 6 months after the last German soldier had quit the Demyansk salient, the Wehrmacht was driving toward the city that would come to carry all their ambitions and all their illusions. The advance toward Stalingrad had begun in the summer, pushing southeast with an intensity born of desperation, for time was no longer their ally. Autumn turned the grasslands golden, then grey, and still the columns advanced, though with a weariness now creeping into the reports and dispatches. By November, as the first snow began to fall and the days grew shorter, the German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, had driven deep into the city itself, street by street, building by building, their supplies stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers of exposed steppe. And then, in the darkness of November, with the suddenness of an avalanche, the Soviet winter counteroffensive began. Not one blow, but a carefully orchestrated symphony of encirclement. The Wehrmacht's Hungarian and Romanian allies, their equipment inadequate and their morale fragile, began to collapse along the flanks. The Soviet armies, their reserves finally gathered and their tactics now refined through bitter experience, swept around the German position with a force that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The Wehrmacht commander, Paulus, watched in shock as his army was slowly, then suddenly, enclosed within a shrinking perimeter. By November 23rd, the ring was closed. Approximately 300,000 soldiers of the Sixth Army, along with elements of the Fourth Panzer Army, found themselves trapped in a pocket that stretched across the frozen city and the barren steppe beyond it. In the headquarters where generals paced and radio men transmitted urgent orders, something peculiar happened. Instead of the immediate authorization for a breakout, instead of the desperate dash westward that might have saved hundreds of thousands of lives, there came a fateful message from Hitler himself. The Sixth Army would hold. The Sixth Army would not retreat. The Sixth Army would remain in Stalingrad, fortress-like and defiant. And why would the German High Command accept what seemed to reasonable men like certain annihilation? Because, they reasoned, the Luftwaffe had performed a miracle at Demyansk. The Luftwaffe could do it again. Here lay the terrible seed of illusion. The mathematics were obvious to anyone who would examine them, yet they were ignored. Demyansk had required roughly 300 tons of supplies per day to sustain 100,000 men in relatively static positions during a brief siege. Stalingrad would require 10 times that tonnage, perhaps more, because the fighting was constant and the weather would be far more severe. The Demyansk airlift had been supplied from numerous bases across a relatively short distance. The Stalingrad airlift would need to operate across the entire width of the Ukraine, from bases still threatened by advancing Soviet forces, across defensive fronts that grew more unstable by the day. And yet, the commanders allowed hope to override mathematics. They allowed myth to replace calculation. They allowed Demyansk to be the precedent that justified the unjustifiable. General Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, was summoned to Hitler's presence. The dictator's question was simple and direct. Could the Air Force supply the Sixth Army? Göring, either from loyalty, desperation, or a profound misreading of the situation, replied that it could. The tone of his answer contained an absolute certainty that the documents would later reveal he did not actually feel. But it was the answer Hitler wished to hear, and so it became the answer upon which millions of lives would be wagered. The order went out. Sixth Army would hold. Relief would come by land. If the land relief proved insufficient, supplies would come from the air. This was not strategy. This was faith masquerading as planning. As winter settled across Stalingrad with a ferocity that seemed almost personified, the Luftwaffe began to mobilize every transport aircraft it could spare. The same Junkers 52s that had droned above Demyansk were now hurriedly transferred southward. Additional aircraft were conscripted from training units, from training squadrons, from anywhere they could be found. But the distances were longer, the targets smaller, the weather deadlier, and the Soviet opposition far more organized and far more relentless. The pilots who flew these routes spoke of temperatures so extreme that hydraulic fluid froze, that bomb sight mechanisms became brittle as ice, that a man's exposed flesh would turn to useless pulp in minutes. The airfields from which they departed became morasses of mud and snow as winter deepened. The landing zones inside Stalingrad shrank daily as the Soviet forces compressed the pocket, and the accuracy required for supply drops increased while the ability to achieve it decreased. The city itself, this vast monument to human industry that the Germans had shattered block by block, now became the grave they would dig within it. The streets were lined with the frozen bodies of men, both German and Soviet, so numerous that the living sometimes had to move them in order to walk. Shelters were carved from cellars and rubble. Rations, when they came, were cut again and again. The promise of the airlift became a whisper, then a rumor, then a fairy tale that men no longer quite believed. And yet still, day after day, the supply transports climbed into the grey skies and turned toward the Holocaust. The bitter irony, known to historians but hidden from the soldiers dying in that pocket, was that the decision to hold at Stalingrad was not made because the German command had faith in the airlift's ability to sustain them indefinitely. It was made because Hitler could not bear the psychological weight of surrender or retreat. The airlift was not the reason for holding Stalingrad. The holding of Stalingrad was the justification that came afterward for why an airlift would be attempted, no matter the cost. The causation ran backward, from will to rationalization, and in that reversed order of reasoning lay the seeds of catastrophe. And so the winter deepened, and the airlift continued its impossible task, and within the pocket men waited for a relief that would never arrive and for supplies that never came in sufficient measure. The ghost of Demyansk walked across those frozen steppes, a comforting phantom that kept commanders from making the hard choice, that kept men dying when survival might yet have been possible. History was not about to repeat itself at Stalingrad. History was about to surpass itself in tragedy. Yet beneath that triumph at Demyansk lay fractures no one wished to examine. The airlift had worked, yes, but at a cost that became visible only when the invoices were tallied in the grinding months that followed. The Luftwaffe, stretched already across a continent of war, had poured its transport capacity into those frozen skies above the Valdai hills, and every Junkers 52 that droned eastward was a machine no longer available to ferry supplies elsewhere, to bolster other fronts, to sustain the machinery of conquest that still hungered for Moscow, for the Caucasus, for any promise of decisive victory. Consider what had been required. Each day, roughly 300 tons of cargo had to arrive inside that pocket to keep 100,000 men barely alive. Ammunition, fuel, food rationed to near starvation, medical supplies for the wounded who lay in dugouts without anesthetic. 300 tons. The Luftwaffe's transport fleet, when mobilized entirely for this single purpose, could muster perhaps 400 tons on an optimistic day. That meant there was almost no margin, almost no surplus, almost no room for weather delays or enemy interference or mechanical breakdown. One bad winter storm, one coordinated Soviet fighter sweep, one fuel shortage at the air bases in the rear, and the entire calculus collapsed. The pilots knew this with an intimacy that was almost unbearable. They flew these routes knowing that their machines were fragile, that the weather held no mercy, that the range calculations allowed barely enough fuel to reach the pocket and return home without emergency landings. There was a particular kind of terror in this mathematics, the terror of knowing you were part of a system that had no redundancy, no safety, no buffer between supply and catastrophe. Letters home from transport pilots speak of this quiet despair, of a fatalism that settled over the crews like fog. They flew because they were ordered to, because their comrades below depended on them, because stopping meant abandonment, but they flew knowing that this could not last indefinitely, that the Luftwaffe's reserves were finite, that every mission burned irreplaceable resources. And then came the realization, slow and terrible, that Demyansk's success had created a dangerous precedent, a kind of template that was already being studied in the high command with an almost hungry attention. Hitler, in particular, had seized upon the airlift as proof of a principle he wanted desperately to believe, that an encircled army need not surrender, that air power could perform miracles, that fortress warfare could substitute for maneuver, that sacrifice and will could overcome the mathematics of logistics. This was a seductive idea, especially to a leader who had already committed his nation to a war he could not afford to lose. The very fact that Demyansk had seemed to work, that those 100,000 men had been fed and armed and held in place through an entire winter, became dangerous in the hands of men who were beginning to consider far larger encirclements. But here is where the gap begins to widen, where the crucial difference between Demyansk and what was coming becomes visible to anyone who studies the maps with careful eyes. Demyansk was, relatively speaking, intimate in scale. The pocket was smaller, the distances shorter, the climate, though brutal, was at least familiar to German logisticians who had been operating in this theatre for months. The air bases supporting the lift were reasonably close, The Junkers 52s could complete multiple sorties in a day. The Luftwaffe had other commitments, yes, but they were not yet catastrophic. Now imagine that same principle applied to a city that stretched for kilometers along the banks of the Volga. Imagine an encirclement that was not 100,000 men, but rather perhaps 4 times that number, perhaps more. Imagine supply requirements that would dwarf Demyansk's by an order of magnitude. Imagine the same Luftwaffe, already worn from months of continuous operations, now asked to sustain not just a pocket, but a sprawling urban fortress in a landscape where every flight had to cover far greater distances, where the weather was even more capricious, where Soviet air defenses were multiplying with each passing week. The transport squadrons that had just barely managed to feed Demyansk would have been wholly inadequate for this larger task. Yet the logic that had succeeded once, or appeared to succeed, began to calcify into doctrine. In staff meetings and command posts, the conversations shifted. Officers who had been skeptical began to mutter less loudly. Planning documents began to reference the airlift precedent as if it were a guaranteed solution rather than a remarkable feat of desperation. The psychological infection was spreading, the dangerous idea taking root that encirclement was no longer a death sentence if you had faith in air power and the will to hold at all costs. But even as these plans were being refined, even as men in comfortable headquarters were drawing lines on maps and calculating tonnages, the actual strain on the Luftwaffe's transport fleet was becoming visible to anyone who looked closely. The losses accumulated steadily, not dramatic, catastrophic losses, but the slow, patient attrition of machines wearing out, pilots growing exhausted, replacement aircraft and crews coming forward far too slowly. Fuel shortages in the air bases that supported the Demyansk lift meant that not every plane that wanted to fly could fly. Missions were sometimes cancelled because there was simply not enough gasoline to complete the round trip reliably. It was a fragile system, and it was deteriorating. What makes this moment so poignant, perhaps so tragic, is that the very success of Demyansk contained the seeds of future catastrophe. Had the airlift failed, had it proven impossible to sustain an encircled army by air, the lesson would have been clear and unambiguous. Officers would have drawn the logical conclusion: encirclement must be avoided, or if it occurs, the trapped force must break out or surrender. But the airlift had not failed. It had succeeded, just barely, in conditions that were unique and perhaps unrepeatable. That ambiguous victory was, in a strange way, far more dangerous than a clear defeat would have been. The question that historians have examined again and again is whether different men, cooler heads, minds less influenced by the intoxication of previous success, might have recognized this trap. But the answer is complex, because success is always more persuasive than caution, and when you are already committed to a war that is increasingly desperate, the promise of a solution, any solution, is almost irresistible. The machines were there, the pilots were willing, the precedent existed. Who could blame commanders for thinking that what had been done once might be done again, even on a larger scale, even against worse odds? And so, in the deep winter of 1942, even as the Demyansk Pocket was being slowly replenished by its aerial lifeline, minds in the high command were already turning toward new objectives, new encirclements, new opportunities to test whether the miracle of the airlift was a singular event or the opening of a new era in warfare. The tragedy lay in the fact that the question would be answered definitively, but only through catastrophe, only through the suffering of hundreds of thousands of men, only through a repetition of the Demyansk scenario, at a scale that the Luftwaffe's transport fleet, worn and struggling as it already was, could never hope to sustain. By late April of 1942, the ice was breaking on the Lovat River. The thaw that comes each spring to northwestern Russia arrived with the peculiar quiet that always follows a long siege. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of exhaustion. The Demyansk Pocket, which had held out for more than 3 months against the weight of Soviet artillery and winter itself, was beginning to dissolve not from final military collapse, but from the slow, grinding logic of attrition and the gradual realization among German commanders that the pocket could not, in fact, be held forever. The evacuation began not as an orderly withdrawal but as a series of difficult decisions, each one made under the grey sky of a Russian spring that offered little comfort. General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, who had commanded the Second Army Corps throughout the siege, understood better than most that remaining longer in the pocket served no strategic purpose, only the brutal mathematics of casualty lists. The order came down through the Wehrmacht chain of command. The pocket would be held just long enough to allow a controlled breakout, coordinated with a relief push from German forces to the south. It was a dance of terrible precision, requiring the soldiers inside the pocket to hold their lines just long enough while simultaneously preparing to abandon them. Imagine the weight of that paradox settling on men already hollowed by months of inadequate food and relentless cold. The Luftwaffe's airlift, which had become almost a point of pride in German military circles, was being quietly acknowledged as insufficient. The figures that had looked promising in Berlin, tonnages delivered, sorties flown, the symbolic victory of supplying an encircled army by air, began to reveal their true emptiness when measured against what the men inside actually needed to survive. A soldier requires not just calories, but the certainty that his sacrifice serves some purpose beyond the ego of a distant commander. By late April, the evacuation corridors were opening. The phrase itself, evacuation corridor, suggests a kind of orderly passage, but what actually occurred was closer to organized chaos filtered through military discipline. The German forces, working alongside their Finnish allies in sectors to the north, pushed southward, while 2 army corps, reorganized into hastily arranged columns, withdrew toward the strengthening German lines. Soviet forces, aware that their moment to destroy an entire army corps was slipping away, pressed harder. The fighting during the breakout, though less widely remembered than the months of siege itself, was no less vicious. Soviet artillery and infantry, aware that a prize was escaping, threw everything they had into blocking the retreat routes. The soldiers who came out of the pocket emerged changed in ways that were difficult to fully articulate. Many were recovering from varying degrees of frostbite. Others carried wounds that had been treated not with modern medicine, but with whatever improvised measures a field medic could manage, with winter temperatures plummeting far below the point where normal healing occurs. The malnutrition was visible in their faces, cheekbones prominent in ways that suggested something deeper than temporary hunger, something that spoke to weeks of eating horse meat, scraped of every possible nutrient, to bread made from whatever grain could be stretched thin enough to feed thousands. What is perhaps most striking about the evacuation is how quickly the pocket seemed to fade from the collective consciousness, even as it was happening. The Demyansk Pocket had commanded headlines in Germany, had been celebrated as a triumph of will and German military innovation. Yet as the soldiers filed out, as the wounded were loaded onto the few available transport vehicles, the narrative shifted almost imperceptibly. The siege was over, the pocket had held, Germany had won, or so the official record suggested. The costs were remarkable only in their silence. The human toll, pieced together carefully by historians in the decades that followed, remained something of a whisper in the wider tragedy of the Eastern Front. Of the roughly 100,000 men enclosed in the pocket, approximately 30,000 were killed, wounded, or missing during the entire siege and breakout. 30,000 is a number so large it ceases to have meaning in any ordinary sense. It is individual men, each one someone's son, someone's husband, someone's brother, but it is also an abstraction, a statistic that fits neatly into casualty tables and military histories. What is lost in those numbers are the small details. The private named Helmut, who survived the pocket only to die 6 months later at Rzhev, the radio operator who returned home with frostbitten hands that would never fully regain their feeling, the cook, who lasted through all those months of siege only to be killed by a Soviet sniper during the breakout. The evacuation of wounded men presents its own particular sorrow. The Luftwaffe planes that had come in so regularly with supplies now reversed their purpose, attempting to fly out the most severely injured. But the capacity was never sufficient. There were always more wounded than space on the aircraft. The decisions about who would be evacuated and who would remain to be transported by other means, decisions that had to be made quickly, in the cold, by overworked medical officers, represented a form of triage that the military records attempted to render as rational and necessary, but which haunted those who had to make them. By the time the pocket was finally declared closed and eliminated from the German order of battle, it had become something of an embarrassment. The triumph that had been broadcast across Germany, the Luftwaffe's ability to sustain an army in the field by air, had been achieved, technically, but at costs that suggested perhaps the cost itself should never be incurred again. Yet this was a lesson that would not be learned. The name Demyansk itself began its slow fade into the background of military memory. It had been useful as a symbol, as proof of concept, as evidence that the German Wehrmacht possessed tactical and logistical capabilities beyond what enemy planners had anticipated. But symbols lose their power once they have served their purpose. The stories of individual soldiers gradually became stories that were told less often, remembered less clearly. Some men who survived went on to longer wars, to other pockets and other siege lines. Some went home. Some simply vanished into the larger machinery of the Eastern Front, becoming absorbed into units that would move on to other battlegrounds, other stories. What remained, settling like snow across the Russian landscape, was the peculiar amnesia that follows great disasters. The pocket had existed. Nearly 300,000 men, German, Finnish, and Soviet, had fought in and around it. Tens of thousands had died, yet within a few years it had become a historical footnote, mentioned in military histories chiefly because it preceded Stalingrad, because it had illustrated a principle that would be tested again, far more catastrophically, in the streets of a southern city on the Volga. The landscape itself, even as the soldiers were being evacuated, was already returning to its normal state of terrible indifference. The swamps that had partially shielded the pocket were beginning their seasonal transformation. The lakes, that had frozen so completely that trucks could be driven across them, were beginning to show patches of open water. The trenches that had been held with such effort, the bunkers and dugouts where men had survived on the edge of freezing to death, all of it would gradually be reclaimed by moss and birch growth, by the slow work of nature to erase the scars of human violence. The winter mist has returned to the Valdai Hills now, as it does each year when the daylight shrinks and the Lovot River locks beneath its coat of ice. The landscape remembers nothing of what occurred there, and yet, in a quiet way, it holds everything. The forests stand silent. The snow falls without judgment, and if you were to walk those woods today, you would find only the ordinary marks of seasons turning, no monuments, no visible reminder that 100,000 men once huddled in frozen trenches, waiting for planes that might not come, writing letters they hoped would reach home. Memory is a strange keeper of history. It selects what it will hold close and what it allows to drift away, and the Demyansk Pocket has largely drifted. It is not as famous as Stalingrad, not as monumental in the collective remembering of that vast Eastern Front war. And yet, standing here now, in this quietness, we might ask ourselves whether the story we have just followed, the hunger, the cold, the terrible mathematics of tonnage and fuel, Whether all of that somehow mattered more precisely because it was forgotten, because in that forgetting lies a kind of truth that monuments and commemorations sometimes obscure. The Pocket's evacuation came in April of 1942. The breakthrough corridor that had seemed so fragile, so impossible, held just long enough. Something like 200,000 German and Allied soldiers managed to withdraw, though the price of that salvation was written in bodies left behind, in the faces of men who did not make it back. The Luftwaffe lost hundreds of aircraft and thousands of trained pilots over those months. The transport squadrons that had been mobilized for what many thought would be a temporary operation found themselves permanently depleted, their strength divided when the greater crisis came. The airlift at Demyansk had worked, in the narrowest, most technical sense. Supplies arrived, men survived. But the triumph was a mirage, and like all mirages, it drew those who saw it toward their own destruction. For this is the weight of the story, the thing that lingers in the silence after the narrative ends. Hitler saw in Demyansk a proof of concept, a demonstration that the Luftwaffe could sustain isolated armies indefinitely, that geography and encirclement need not mean surrender. This belief, this dangerous certainty, became embedded in the thinking of the German High Command. When Sixth Army found itself surrounded at Stalingrad just months later, that same assumption was voiced in staff meetings and situation reports. Surely, the reasoning went, if we could hold Demyansk, we can hold this. The mathematics would be different, the distances greater, the scale incomparably larger, but the principle would hold. Air power would keep the army alive. Fortresses could be provisioned from the sky. How many times in war, in any human endeavor perhaps, do we mistake a narrow victory for a universal law? Demyansk had worked because the pocket was relatively small, because the terrain had eventually allowed for a corridor of land-based supply to form, because the Soviet offensive, for reasons of its own strategy and resources, had not achieved the complete encirclement and destruction it had sought. But at Stalingrad, nearly everything that had favored Demyansk was inverted. The pocket was vastly larger. The distances were immense. The Soviet strategy was unforgiving. The Luftwaffe, already bled by months of attrition, could not deliver even a fraction of what was needed. The promise that air power had seemed to make at Demyansk became a lie at Stalingrad, and hundreds of thousands of men perished in that lie. The pilots who had flown over the frozen forests of the Valdai Hills, who had brought supplies to Demyansk, were often the same men or their immediate comrades who attempted the same feat at Stalingrad. One might imagine the weight of that repetition, the knowledge that what had worked could not work again, and yet the orders came anyway. The machinery of war continued. The bureaucracy of hope operated on its own momentum, indifferent to the cooling calculations of those who understood logistics and distance and the limits of machines. History rarely gives us the luxury of clean learning. It shows us a narrow success and asks us to draw universal conclusions. It shows us a moment where air power seemed to defy geography, and we build doctrine upon that moment, forgetting that moments are fragile things, specific to their circumstances, unrepeatable. The men who survived Demyansk and lived to speak of it knew this, though perhaps not in such formal language. They had been given a second chance, an evacuation, a temporary reprieve. Some of them would be sent to other theaters, to other pockets, to other desperate stands. Some would be captured later, some would go home. But the experience, that knowledge of being surrounded, of waiting for help from the sky, of watching the mathematics of hunger play out on a daily basis, that would never leave them. It becomes a kind of wisdom purchased at an overwhelming price, and when such wisdom is ignored by those in command, ignored in favor of myth and precedent and the stubborn belief that what worked once must work again, there is a particular sting to it. The Valdai Hills have seen many winters since then. The snow falls in the same patterns. The Lovat River freezes and thaws according to the ancient rhythms of the seasons. If the landscape remembers anything, it remembers only itself, the alternation of cold and thaw, the patient work of the forest regrowing what was burned or scarred or simply left bare by human industry. And yet, history does not live in the landscape alone. It lives in how we tell the story, in what we choose to emphasize and what we choose to overlook. The Demyansk Pocket is sometimes called a success. It is sometimes called a failure. Most often, it is called forgotten, as though that describes what it is rather than what we have done to it. But perhaps there is another way of seeing it. Perhaps in the Demyansk Pocket lies a lesson that history tried very hard to teach, and that was heard only partially, imperfectly, too late. It is the lesson that narrow victories are not blueprints, that exceptions do not become rules simply because we wish them to, that when war places you inside a circle of enemies with no way out, air power is a lifeline, yes, but a fragile one, dependent on distances and resources and the cooperation of enemies who will not cease trying to break you. And that when the very same situation arises again, scaled up beyond all proportion, the lifeline will snap. There is a kind of mercy in forgetting, one might argue. The soldiers who endured Demyansk are mostly gone now. The pilots who flew those dangerous routes are old, if they survived at all, or they, too, are part of the vast quiet of the past. Their letters home, the ones that did make it through, have found their way into archives, into academic studies, into the slow work of historians trying to reconstruct the texture of lived experience from fragments. The cold they endured, the hunger, the particular terror of being surrounded. These things cannot be fully conveyed in a documentary, in a narration, in any words at all. They can only be approximated, and that approximation is all we ever have. What remains, as the mist falls once more on the Valdai hills, is the question itself. Not the answer. The answer fades with the men who lived it. But the question, how do institutions learn? How does military strategy evolve when each new circumstance feels like the last one, scaled or shifted slightly but fundamentally the same? How do we distinguish between the wisdom of experience and the tyranny of precedent? These are questions that history raises not once, but over and over, in different guises, different wars, different moments of desperation. And we, the inheritors of these stories, are left to contemplate them in the silence that follows the narrative. The winter deepens. The snow continues its patient work, covering old ground, making everything new, making everything the same. Somewhere in the accumulated quiet of all those years, the truth of Demyansk persists, not in monuments or in famous commemorations, but in the very structure of how things unfolded afterward, in Stalingrad, in other pockets, in the slow, terrible logic of a war that was already lost, that continued anyway because institutions, like rivers,